there is a place between two rivers where civilization decided to begin. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because some wise council sat down and said, "This is where we'll build the future." It just happened, the way most extraordinary things happen, slowly, and then all at once, driven by hunger and water and the stubborn human need to make something permanent out of a world that keeps trying to wash everything away. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They begin their lives in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, two separate threads of snowmelt and rainfall cutting south and southeast through stone and dust until they reach a flat, open plain that stretches toward the Persian Gulf. Today we call that plain Iraq. 4,000 years ago, people called it the land where the gods first separated sky from earth. 6,000 years ago, they didn't have a name for it yet because writing hadn't been invented. And that, in a strange way, is exactly the point. Everything we're going to explore tonight starts here, in this flat, hot, unpromising stretch of land that somehow became the place where humans figured out how to write things down, build cities, pass laws, tell epic stories, track the stars, and argue over property rights. Not in that order, and not all at once, but eventually all of it. So before we get there, let's just sit with the landscape for a moment. Imagine standing on that plain around 10,000 years ago. The air is warm, the rivers are visible from a distance, a slight glitter against the flat horizon. This part of the world sits in what geographers call the Fertile Crescent, an arc of relatively hospitable land, curving from the Persian Gulf up through modern Iraq and Syria, and down through the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And within that arc, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley is something special. Each year, the rivers flood, not gently, not predictably, but with a kind of seasonal violence that tears up the soil and deposits it freshly across the plain. And deposited soil means nutrients. Nutrients mean plants. Plants mean animals. Animals and plants together mean people can eat. And if people can eat reliably in one place, they tend to stop moving around so much. That is the first thing the valley offered. Food, or at least the possibility of it if you were clever enough, and patient enough, and willing to work hard enough to coax it out of the ground. The second thing the valley offered was connection. The Tigris and Euphrates aren't just water sources. They're highways. Long before there were roads, before there were wheels, before there were horses pulling carts, there were rivers, and if you had a raft or a simple boat you could float downstream carrying goods, carrying people, carrying ideas. The rivers linked communities that might otherwise have remained completely isolated, and that linkage matters more than almost anything else in the story we're about to tell. Because civilization isn't just about farming or building. It's about people talking to each other across distances, trading, arguing, copying each other's innovations, and occasionally going to war, which also, in its destructive way, spreads ideas from one group to another. But here's the question that should keep you curious as we settle into this story. Why here? The Fertile Crescent covers a lot of territory. There were farmers in the hills to the north, long before the valley became the centre of anything. There were communities forming along rivers in Egypt and the Indus Valley and China around roughly the same period in history. So why did something so particular happen in this specific place between these two specific rivers? Why did cities appear here first, or at least among the first in the entire human story? Why did writing emerge here? Why did the mathematics and astronomy and legal codes that would eventually shape every civilization that came after? Why did all of that originate in this flat, often brutal, flood-prone stretch of ancient Iraq? There isn't one clean answer. There never is with history. But there are some deeply interesting possibilities, and we'll trace them carefully through the night. What we do know is that the story spans an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. We're talking roughly 10,000 years from the first farming villages, perched on the edges of the valley, all the way to the moment when Mesopotamia, as the ancient Greeks would eventually call it, meaning simply the land between the rivers, finally dissolved into the Persian Empire and became something else, something new, something that carried Mesopotamian fingerprints, while calling itself by a different name. 10,000 years. Think about that. The entire modern era, everything from the Renaissance through the Industrial Revolution, through the age of computers, covers roughly 500 years. The story of ancient Mesopotamia covers 20 times that length. And within those 10,000 years, almost everything changes. Villages become towns, towns become cities, cities become city-states, locked in constant competition with each other, jostling for control of water and trade routes and prestige. Then suddenly one ruler figures out how to hold many cities together under a single authority, and empire becomes possible. Empires collapse, get rebuilt, collapse again, languages rise and fade. Gods are invented, renamed, imported from neighbouring cultures, retired. Kings claim to speak for the divine, and then other kings come along and claim exactly the same thing, and displace everyone who came before. Laws get written, then rewritten. Then the civilization that wrote them gets conquered by someone who writes their own laws. And somehow human life keeps accumulating, layer by layer, season by season, flood by flood. The ancient Mesopotamians were among the first people on Earth who seemed deeply aware that time was passing, and that things had been different before. They kept records. They wrote king lists that tracked dynasties going back impossibly far, probably mixing legend with real history, but the instinct matters. The instinct to remember, to write it down, to say this happened and then this happened and then this king came and then this flood came and we survived it. That instinct, the need to preserve and transmit memory across time, is maybe the most Mesopotamian thing about Mesopotamia. It's a river valley that learned to remember, and over the course of tonight, we'll trace exactly what it remembered and what it built. We'll meet the first farmers who nudged their way down from the hills and discovered what could grow in that rich, difficult soil. We'll watch the irrigation systems take shape. Channels dug by hand through the floodplain, networks of water management so complex they required entirely new forms of social organization just to keep them running. We'll stand at the gates of Uruk, which may well be the first true city in human history, and we'll try to understand what it actually meant when thousands of people started living together in one place for the first time. We'll see writing born, and it won't be born the way you might expect. It won't come from poets or priests first. It'll come from accountants, from the very human need to track who owes what to whom. We'll follow empires rising, Sargon of Akkad, a figure so dramatic and so consequential that later rulers were still invoking his name as a model of greatness more than 2,000 years after he died. We'll watch Babylon become a name synonymous with wealth and power and mystery, not once but twice in history, in two completely different eras. We'll sit with the terrifying efficiency of the Assyrian war machine and then watch it collapse with a speed that shocked even the people living through it. And then, at the end, we'll ask the question that might be the most interesting one of all. What did Mesopotamia leave behind? When the Persian Empire folded it into something larger? When Greek and then Arabic, and then Turkish, and then modern cultures layered over it, what survived? More than most people realize, much more, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight is about the long arc, the slow accumulation, the layers. It's about sitting with time and letting it move at its own pace. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? What time is it where you're listening from? I genuinely want to know. I check the comments and it's always this beautiful reminder that this reaches everywhere. Someone in Nairobi at dawn, someone in Vancouver slipping toward midnight, someone in Tokyo already deep into the early hours, someone in London at the edge of sleep with rain on the window. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. It's one of my favourite things about making these, because there's something fitting about that actually. about people spread across the world in different time zones, in different cities and villages and houses, all listening to the same ancient story at the same moment. The Mesopotamians were among the first to figure out that connecting across distance and time was one of the most powerful things a human being could do. They built cities to make that connection possible. They invented writing to make it permanent. We're still doing the same thing. We just do it differently now. So settle in. Let the rivers come to you. Let the flat plain of ancient Iraq take shape somewhere behind your eyes. Because this story is 10,000 years long, and it starts very, very quietly with a handful of people watching a flood recede and wondering what might grow in the mud it left behind. Picture a morning somewhere in the hills above the Tigris Valley, maybe 9,000 years ago. A woman is crouching near a stand of wild grass, and she's doing something her grandmother also did, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. She's watching the grain heads carefully, pinching them between her fingers, checking whether the seeds will stay on the stalk long enough to harvest, or whether they'll scatter in the wind the way wild grasses tend to do. She's been watching this particular patch for years. She knows it. And at some point, maybe not this morning, maybe not this season, but sometime across generations of this kind of patient attention, something shifts. Instead of just harvesting what grows, people begin deciding what grows. They start saving seeds from the plants that behave the way they want, the ones that hold their grain a little longer, the ones that grow a little thicker, the ones that come up reliably in the same place year after year. That shift, so quiet and gradual that the people doing it probably didn't register it as a revolution, was the beginning of everything that comes next. The Fertile Crescent sits at an unusual intersection of climate and geography. The hills that arc through what is now southern Turkey, northern Syria, northern Iraq, and down toward the eastern Mediterranean were home, around 12,000 years ago, to a remarkable concentration of wild plants and animals that turned out to be unusually suited to domestication. Wild emmer wheat, wild barley, wild lentils and chickpeas, wild sheep and goats moving in herds through the rocky slopes, aurochs, the massive ancestors of modern cattle grazing in the valleys between. The raw materials of agriculture were sitting there, waiting, and the people of the Fertile Crescent, clever, adaptable, already skilled at reading landscapes and seasons, after tens of thousands of years of foraging, were exactly the kind of people who could notice those raw materials and begin to work with them. Wheat and barley were the foundations. Not the refined grains we'd recognize today, but rough-husked, variable, still halfway between wild and domestic. Over centuries of selective cultivation, they became more reliable, more productive, easier to process. Sheep and goats followed a similar arc. Wild animals that tolerated human proximity got fed, got moved, got separated from the ones that didn't cooperate. Generation by generation, the distance between wild and tame collapsed. By around 9,000 years ago, you have settlements in places like the Zagros Mountains along what is now the Iran-Iraq border, where the archaeological evidence shows people clearly managing herds, storing grain in purpose-built containers, returning to the same site year after year because they had reasons to stay. That's the key change, and it's worth pausing on it. For the hundreds of thousands of years before this, the default mode of human life was movement. Follow the animals, follow the season, follow the water. Agriculture didn't just change what people ate, it changed their relationship to place. Now you had crops in the ground that needed tending. You had stored grain that needed protecting. You had animals that needed watching. You couldn't just walk away when conditions got difficult, the way a foraging band might drift to better territory. You were committed. The soil held you as firmly as you held it. Early farming villages in the foothills of the Zagros and the Taurus Mountains were modest things. A cluster of rectangular mud-brick houses arranged without much obvious planning, each one housing a family, maybe an extended family. The floors were beaten earth, The roofs were flat, made from branches and mud, and people likely slept up there on warm nights, watching the stars. Inside you'd find grinding stones for processing grain, fired clay vessels beginning to appear for storage and cooking, small figurines of women and animals that probably had some meaning we can only guess at, and tools, chipped obsidian blades, bone awls, woven baskets lining the walls. The pottery is worth slowing down on, actually, because it shows up in the archaeological record as one of the clearest markers of this period, and it tells us things a mud brick floor can't. The earliest ceramic vessels weren't beautiful. They were functional. Rough fired clay containers for storing grain, for fermenting liquids, for carrying water. But even in the earliest examples, people decorated them. Geometric patterns pressed into the wet clay before firing, simple lines and hatching. Later, more elaborate designs, painted in ochre and black. Why bother decorating a storage jar? Probably the same reason we put things on our walls and choose colours for our rooms. Because humans have always used objects to signal identity, to mark belonging, to make the domestic space feel like theirs. The pottery of the early farming villages is, in a strange way, the first interior design. The figurines are harder to read. Small clay or stone figures of women with exaggerated hips and breasts show up across dozens of early sites in the region. Animal figures too, cattle and sheep rendered with real attention. Archaeologists have argued about what these mean for more than a century, and the honest answer is, we don't fully know. Some researchers see them as evidence of a goddess cult, a widespread veneration of female fertility that preceded and possibly shaped later Mesopotamian religion. Others are more cautious, noting that we can't assume a figure means worship. It might mean almost anything: a toy, a teaching tool, a family charm, a memorial. What we can say is that the people of these early villages were making objects with meaning beyond pure utility. They were building a symbolic life alongside their material one, and that instinct to make meaning out of clay and stone runs directly into the temples and ritual spaces of the great cities that come later. Now, here's where things get quietly complicated, because once you have stored grain and permanent settlement, you have something else too. You have the possibility of having more than your neighbour. Some households accumulate better seed stock, some families own more animals, some individuals are better at organising labour or negotiating with other groups, and they get rewarded for it. The early farming villages of the Fertile Crescent show signs, subtle but real, of economic differentiation. Larger houses alongside smaller ones, some burials with goods, shells and beads, and carefully placed tools, while others have nothing at all. We're not talking about anything like the extreme inequality that shows up later in urban Mesopotamia, with palaces and slave labour and royal tombs full of gold. But the seed of it is there, in the quiet logic of surplus. When there's more than enough, some people end up with more than others, and that gap, once opened, tends to widen. Leadership probably emerged the same way. Someone had to settle disputes about water access. Someone had to coordinate planting and harvest when the labour demands exceeded what any one household could meet. Someone had to represent the community when travellers from other groups arrived and trade needed to be negotiated. These roles probably rotated at first, falling to whoever had the most respect in a given situation. Over time, some families accumulated enough status that their claim to those roles became more or less permanent. We can't see this in the archaeological record directly, but we can infer it from the way things develop. The shift from roughly equal households to clearly differentiated ones doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen randomly. It follows the logic of agricultural surplus, and early villages were already moving in that direction. And then there are the objects that don't belong. Every few seasons, archaeologists digging at these early sites turn up something that shouldn't be there. A piece of obsidian from a volcanic source 300 miles away. A shell from the Mediterranean coast, carried inland across mountains and valleys to end up in a house on the Zagros slope. Copper beads from deposits that don't exist locally. These objects are quiet evidence of something enormous, that even before cities, before writing, before formal trade systems of any kind, people were connected across vast distances. Someone travelled or something was passed hand to hand through networks of exchange, moving materials from where they occurred naturally to communities that wanted them. Obsidian was especially prized because it naps into an edge sharper than almost any other stone, and the Fertile Crescent has almost none of its own. The nearest major sources were in Anatolia, in what is now central Turkey. Getting obsidian to a village in northern Iraq required either very long journeys or very long chains of exchange, and both possibilities tell us that these early farming communities were not isolated. They were talking to each other, trading with each other, aware of a larger world beyond the nearest valley. What archaeology can and cannot prove about these communities is a boundary worth respecting. We can read the physical traces, the seeds in the storage pits, the ash layers in the hearths, the orientation of the houses, the distribution of the artifacts. What we can't read, not directly, is what these people thought about their lives, what stories they told, what they feared, what they hoped for. We can make educated inferences. We can notice patterns and what they imply. But the inner life of a woman grinding barley on a stone floor in 8000 BCE is beyond our reach, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What we can say is this. By the time the farming villages of the hill country began to extend their reach down toward the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, something deeply important had already happened. Human beings had reorganized their relationship to the land, to time, and to each other. They had invented storage, and storage is another word for future. They had invented surplus, and surplus is another word for possibility. And possibility, in a river valley that flooded every year and left behind the richest soil in the ancient world, was about to become something no one could have predicted. Follow the rivers downstream from those first hill villages, and the world changes around you. The ground stops rolling and flattens into an enormous, almost featureless plain. The horizon widens. The soil underfoot turns to deep, dark silt, easily worked, frighteningly fertile. This is southern Mesopotamia, the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the land between two rivers becomes more like a shallow, muddy bowl. It looks like a farmer's dream, but it comes with a catch. Out here, rain is scarce. The further south you go, the less the sky gives you. The rivers are everything. They carry snowmelt and spring floods from mountains hundreds of miles away, and when those floods spread across the plain, they drop thin layers of fresh silt, renewing the fields the way the Nile does in Egypt. But the Tigris and Euphrates are not gentle rivers. Their flood timing is erratic. Some years they overflow violently, drowning fields and sweeping away huts. Other years they barely rise at all, leaving crops to wither. You can't build a stable life if your fields live or die on that level of chance. In the hills, rain-fed agriculture was risky but manageable. Down here, dry farming on the open plain simply doesn't work at scale. You either learn to control the water, or the water controls you. So sometime in the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, people began to dig. At first it was probably simple. A ditch cut from the riverbank to a nearby field. A low earth wall to hold back or direct flow. Families or neighbouring households could manage that on their own. But the physics of water, especially in a flat landscape, nudges you onward. Once one group upstream cuts a channel, the patterns of flow downstream change. New wet spots appear, old ones dry out. If you want to bring water to a field a mile or 3 miles, from the river, a single ditch won't do. You need a chain of channels, each at just the right gradient, each maintained, each cleared of silt. That's not a one-household job. That's the beginning of coordination. Southern Mesopotamia, with its minimal rainfall and heavy dependence on the rivers, is one of those places where irrigation isn't a luxury. It's survival. Archaeologists looking at sites in the region find evidence of canal beds and controlled water flow very early in the story, long before cities in the full sense appear. The plain itself almost forces the issue. There is no just plant and hope the rains come out here. The rains don't come, the water is in the rivers, and if you want it on your land, you have to move it. Imagine being part of one of those early canal projects. It's not just a matter of digging randomly. Someone has to decide where the intake will be, how far the canal will run, how to keep it high enough above the surrounding ground that water will still flow at the far end. You don't have writing. You probably don't even have formal geometry. But you have eyes, experience, and memory. You pound pegs into the ground to mark a line. You watch how quickly water drains out of a test trench. You notice that if you get the slope wrong, the canal either stagnates and silts up, or cuts so deeply into the ground that it no longer reaches the fields you want to irrigate. Out of this kind of practical tinkering comes something like surveying. Not with metal instruments and trigonometry, but with ropes, poles, and shared mental maps. People begin to think in terms of measures of land, of distances between this field and that intake, of how much water will reach the end of the line if 10 other plots are drawing from it first. This isn't yet the world of scribes and tablets, but the seed of that mentality is already sprouting. Before you write numbers down, you have to care about numbers in the first place. Once the canals are in place, the benefits are enormous. The alluvial soil is so rich that a properly watered field of barley can produce far beyond the needs of the household that works it. Surplus stops being an occasional good year and becomes a regular feature of life. Granaries fill. People who would once have had to spend most of their time coaxing food out of marginal land now find that the land, if fed with river water, gives more than enough. That excess starts to rearrange society again, because surplus doesn't just mean more food. It means more options. Some people can specialize. If a cluster of irrigated fields near a settlement reliably produces more grain than the local farmers' families need, a few individuals can afford to spend less time in the fields and more time at other tasks. Weavers, potters, fishermen, people who maintain the canals themselves as a dedicated role. Maybe a few individuals who begin to take on full-time positions as organizers, overseers, priests. Those new roles don't appear out of thin air. They emerge in response to the demands of the irrigation system itself. Water has to be let into certain canals on certain days. Gates have to be opened and closed. Silt has to be dredged out before it blocks the flow. Flood damage has to be repaired before the next planting season. None of that happens automatically. It happens because groups of people show up together at the right time, with tools in hand. Coordinating that kind of labour is a delicate business. It depends on trust, reputation, and probably increasingly on institutions. In southern Mesopotamia, two kinds of institutions begin to stand out in the archaeological record as focal points for managing land and work. What we might call great households and cultic or temple establishments. A great household is more than a nuclear family. It's an extended kin group, plus attached dependents and maybe even outsiders who work the household's land in return for rations. As irrigation expands, some of these households accumulate rights to larger and larger tracts of field, especially those in prime positions along the canals. They become miniature economic units employing labourers, storing grain, lending seed, perhaps even sponsoring the construction or repair of nearby channels. Temples, in the broad sense of community cult places, begin to do something similar. Even in very early levels at sites like Eridu and other southern settlements, archaeologists see buildings that are clearly set apart from regular houses. Slightly raised platforms, repeated rebuilding on the same spot, offerings left in and around them. Around these cult centres, associated storage facilities appear. Bins, silos, spaces that look like they were used for keeping large amounts of grain, oil, or other goods. It's not hard to imagine the logic. The community's god or gods embodied in the temple space are thanked for the water that makes life possible. People bring offerings. The temple, in turn, begins to hold resources that can be redistributed: food for the poor, rations for workers, seed grain after a bad flood. Managing those flows of goods requires oversight. Perhaps a priestly household resides there, or a group of officials whose job is to keep track of what comes in and what goes out. Now we're close to the first true administrators, even if they don't yet leave written job descriptions behind. They have to remember how many workers turned up for canal dredging last month, who has already received their share of next season's seed, which field lies fallow this year, and which will be sown. Memory and spoken agreements are the only tools available, so people with unusually strong capacities for recall and organisation become valuable. Over time, those mental habits, counting, listing, balancing, solidify into an administrative mindset that will later find its perfect match in clay tablets covered with signs. But irrigation also carries a quiet threat, one that won't fully reveal itself for generations. The rivers of Mesopotamia bring not just water and silt, but dissolved salts washed down from the upstream rocks. In a natural floodplain, those salts percolate away or are spread so thinly that they don't matter. In an irrigated field where water is brought in deliberately and allowed to evaporate from the surface year after year, the salts stay behind in the upper soil. At first the effect is invisible. The crops grow well. Yields are high. But slowly, as decades pass, the balance shifts. Barley, which is more salt-tolerant, begins to outperform wheat. In later millennia we can see this clearly in the record. Wheat disappears from southern Mesopotamian crop assemblages, replaced almost entirely by barley. Some fields seem to have been abandoned altogether, likely because they had become too salty to cultivate effectively. This is one of the darker ironies of early success. The more efficiently you bring water onto the land, the more pressure you put on that land's long-term fertility. Canals silt up and need constant maintenance. Fields, if over-irrigated, degrade. And yet populations are growing, built on decades of good harvests. Cities begin to form. People are less and less able simply to pick up and move to new ground the way their ancestors in the hills might have done. By the time salinization becomes a serious problem, whole communities are locked into place by their own infrastructure. Historians and archaeologists have long debated what this irrigation system meant for political power. One influential idea, popular in the mid-20th century, argued that because big canals require coordinated labour, they also require centralised authority. In this view, control of water equals the birth of the state, a hydraulic despotism in which early kings or temple elites used access to irrigation to command obedience. The picture that has emerged in recent decades is more nuanced. The earliest canals we can see archaeologically are modest, often manageable at the village or neighbourhood level. Local groups could have built and maintained them without a full-blown state machinery. But there is still an important feedback loop at work. Once larger city-states do emerge, they certainly make use of irrigation as a lever of control. Temple and palace estates own, or at least claim large irrigated tracts. They organise canal workdays, they distribute rations to workers who show up with their tools and tooks. So perhaps irrigation didn't create the state out of nothing. But it did give early leaders something very concrete to manage, and to justify their authority with. We ensure the water flows is a powerful claim in a land where one failed season could mean famine. By the late 4th millennium BCE, when places like Uruk begin to swell into true cities, this entire system, canals and fields, temple and households, measuring ropes and mental tallies, is already in place. The land between the two rivers has been turned, by human hands and coordinated labour, into an enormous, pulsing garden. The next step, almost inevitable once you're thinking this way, is to stop trusting memory alone. To take a stylus, press it into wet clay, and make the first marks of writing. By the time Uruk steps onto the stage, southern Mesopotamia is already a landscape of canals and villages, temples and great households, administrators who think in numbers even if they can't yet write them down. But Uruk is something different. In the 4th millennium BCE, over the course of just a few centuries, it swells from one more settlement on the plain into something the ancient world had never really seen before, a city. Archaeologists call this the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE. On the ground, it looks like a slow accumulation. A cluster of houses here. A temple rebuilt, made bigger, then rebuilt again, each time more elaborate. New neighbourhoods added along the canals. But when you zoom out, it feels more like an explosion. At its height, Uruk may have had tens of thousands of inhabitants, some estimates even pushing toward 50,000. For the ancient Near East, that's staggering. This is no longer a big village with a few outlying farms. This is a human hive. So what, exactly, makes a city different from a village? Part of it is size, yes, but it's also density and diversity. In a village, you usually know everyone, or at least know who they belong to. Most people do roughly the same kind of work, with small variations. Extended families are the main economic units. In a city like Uruk that breaks down, you can't know everyone. You might never see the people who live in another district on the other side of town. The range of occupations multiplies. Whole neighbourhoods are full of people who do not farm at all. Walk through Uruk in your mind. The outer zones blur into the surrounding fields and palm groves, with farmsteads strung along the canals. But as you move inward, houses crowd closer together. Lanes twist through packed mud brick walls. Courtyards open suddenly, busy with grinding, baking, weaving, brewing. Every turn of a corner might bring you into a district known for one craft: potters firing mass-produced vessels, metal workers hammering copper, textile workers turning river flax and sheep's wool into cloth, on a scale no single household could ever have managed. Then, at the core, you reach something else: monumental space. Uruk's centre is dominated by raised platforms, great stepped terraces and large public buildings. Later tradition will remember the Anna precinct, sacred to the goddess Inanna, and the Anu ziggurat nearby. In the Uruk period we see the early versions of these complexes. Temples built, torn down, and rebuilt larger on the same sacred footprints, like geological strata of devotion. Their walls are decorated with cone mosaics, thousands upon thousands of small coloured clay cones pressed into wet plaster in repeating patterns. Their courtyards are wide enough to host large gatherings. Their storerooms are large enough to hold the surplus of an entire region. These are not houses, they're institutions with their own internal staff, their own herds and fields, their own workshops. They stand apart from the city around them, but they also bind it together. For many scholars, these temple complexes are the beating heart of early urban life. To build and maintain them requires something new: organised urban labour on a massive scale. Think about what goes into one of those platforms alone. First, you have to level and prepare a foundation, sometimes over older buildings. Then you haul in thousands of mud bricks, shaped and dried in the sun. You need teams to mix the mud, others to mould the bricks, others to carry them, others to lay them in courses. You need carpenters for the doors and roof beams, craft specialists for ornamentation, someone to plan the layout so that walls line up and roofs don't collapse. This isn't weekend volunteer work. It's scheduled, rationed, sustained over years. Somewhere in Uruk, there are people whose primary job is to coordinate that labour. To decide who works when, who gets fed from temple stores, Which building takes priority this season? It's the irrigation system logic rewritten on a bigger canvas, applied to the city itself. And the city is not just an economic machine, it's a stage. Temples aren't simply warehouses for grain and offices for early bureaucrats. They are the homes of gods. In Uruk, the divine presence is not an abstract idea, it has an address. The cult statue of Inanna or Anu is fed, washed, dressed. Priests and priestesses move in carefully timed routines. Festivals mark the passing of the seasons, the flooding of the rivers, the turning of the year. On festival days, the city comes together. Processions wind through the streets, bearing offerings from different quarters. Music, chanting, perhaps even early forms of drama unfold in those courtyards and plazas. For many inhabitants, this is their main experience of public life beyond the household. Religion, in that sense, is the first urban politics. It creates a shared calendar, shared narratives, shared spaces where people from different districts and different social strata stand side by side, watching the same ritual unfold. Uruk's influence, though, doesn't stop at its own walls. Across Mesopotamia and beyond, we begin to see what scholars call the Uruk expansion. Sites hundreds of kilometres away, in northern Mesopotamia, in Syria, even in parts of Anatolia and western Iran, suddenly show buildings, pottery and administrative tools that look strikingly like those from Uruk. Whole enclaves appear that seem to be little Uruks in miniature, walled compounds with tripartite halls, bevel-rimmed bowls and clay ceiling practices copied from the southern city. Why did this happen? There is no single agreed answer. One line of thought sees it as colonization. Uruk sending out its people to control trade routes and resources, planting outposts where southern administrators oversaw the movement of grain, wool, or precious stones back to the mother city. Another view suggests something looser, a network of trading stations and diplomatic enclaves where Uruk-style practices spread because they worked well and carried prestige. A third emphasizes local agency, communities in the north, borrowing southern styles and tools to plug themselves into a wider world or to claim some of Uruk's aura of power. The truth may be a mix of all three, varying from region to region. What matters for our story is that by the late 4th millennium, Uruk is no longer just a city. It's a cultural package, architecture, religious imagery, administrative habits, that radiates far beyond its immediate hinterland. One of the most distinctive pieces of that package is a new regime of standardization. In Uruk's levels we find enormous numbers of identical, roughly made clay bowls, sometimes called bevel-rimmed bowls. They're so uniform that they might as well have been stamped from a mould. Many researchers think they were used as ration containers, the standard bowl of grain or beer issued to workers on temple or state projects. If so, they represent not just mass production, but mass accounting. A person isn't paid in some vague portion of food, but in X number of bowls. We also see mass-produced pottery of other kinds, standardized in size and shape, ideal for stacking and transport. Seals and ceilings, small carved stones rolled over wet clay to leave distinctive patterns become ubiquitous. Doors are sealed, jars are sealed, storage rooms are sealed. Each seal impression is both a signature and a guarantee. This container came from this office, passed through these hands, contains what the mark says it contains. Together, these things point to a world where uniformity itself has become valuable. A standard container means you can measure without rethinking your units every time. A standard sign on a seal means you can recognize an authority even if you've never met the person behind it. In an environment where thousands of strangers are interacting every day, that kind of predictability is worth a lot. City life reshapes the most intimate parts of society as well. In a dense urban neighborhood, the old model of a self-sufficient extended family farm becomes harder to maintain. Some households still control land and herds, but many city dwellers now depend on wages or rations from temple and palace estates. A man might spend his days carrying bricks for a building project. A woman might weave in a workshop supplying cloth to the temple. Children might help in small-scale household industries, grinding grain or forming clay vessels destined for a larger distribution system. Craft specialization deepens. Instead of everyone knowing how to do a little of everything, skills concentrate. One lineage becomes known for fine metal work, another for high-quality pottery, another for managing herds owned by the temple. Knowledge is passed down within these groups, becoming more intricate, more guarded. For some, this brings stability and status. For others, it may mean dependence, being locked into a role with little room to maneuver. Class, too, begins to sharpen its outlines. In the material remains of Uruk and other early cities, we can start to see differences in house size and quality. Some dwellings are small, cramped, their construction relatively rough. Others are large, with multiple rooms, interior courtyards, sometimes even private chapels. In the temples we can imagine a hierarchy of officials: high priests, junior priests, scribal apprentices, overseers, and ordinary labourers who receive their daily bowls of barley and beer in return for their work. The city creates new kinds of power: control over grain stores, over labour assignments and rations, over access to the gods' favour, expressed through ritual. These powers don't yet belong to kings in the later sense, but they are already clustering around institutions and individuals who can claim to speak for the community, to organise it, to remember its obligations and promises. At night, when the workday ends, the city probably feels both familiar and strange. Families still gather around hearths, stories are still told. Children still fall asleep listening to the murmur of adult voices. But just outside the doorway, there is a whole other layer of life. The distant sounds of late work in a temple courtyard, the glimmer of lamps in administrative rooms where someone is still counting jars and planning tomorrow's tasks. In Uruk, the river valley has learned not just to remember, but to concentrate memory and labour in one place, to fold thousands of individual lives into a single pulsing organism. And in the middle of that organism, people are starting to do something no one has ever done before. Take their mental tallies, their spoken accounts of who owes what to whom, and press them into clay in the form of little marks and pictures. Writing is about to begin, and with it history in the narrowest sense, records that can outlive the people who made them. Before anyone sits down to write a myth about gods or a king boasting of his victories, there is a much less glamorous problem to solve. How do you keep track? Uruk and its sister cities are now moving thousands of goods through their storehouses every year. Grain, dates, beer, wool, oil, fish, reeds, metal tools, animals. Workers come in, do their assigned tasks, and receive rations. Herds are driven out to pasture and brought back. Canals need dredging, fields need sowing, temple kitchens need supplies for daily offerings and seasonal feasts. In a small village, memory and gossip can manage most of this. Everyone knows roughly who owns what, who borrowed, whose ox, who is late repaying a debt. In a city that falls apart, too many people, too many transactions, too much at stake. So long before we get what we'd recognize as writing, we get something else, accounting. For southern Mesopotamia, the first step along this path doesn't look like text at all. It looks like a jar of tiny clay objects. Across the late Neolithic and into the Uruk period, archaeologists begin finding small clay tokens, usually only a couple of centimetres across. Some are simple cones or spheres, others are more elaborate. Discs, tetrahedrons, little flattened ovals with markings. They're not toys, they're not jewellery. The leading interpretation is that each shape stands for a particular kind of good. A cone might mean a measure of grain, a small sphere, a sheep. Another token might represent a jar of oil or a unit of labour owed. Different regions and periods probably used slightly different codes, and we don't have a Rosetta Stone to translate them precisely. But when these tokens are found in administrative contexts near storerooms, in association with early seals, it starts to make sense. Imagine an overseer in a proto-temple household. A shepherd comes to deliver part of the flock's increase. For every sheep received, the overseer drops a certain token into a bowl. At the end of the day, the tokens are counted and stored. They are a physical stand-in for the things themselves, a movable, durable memory aid. But loose counters are easy to spill, easy to mix up, easy to tamper with. As exchanges grow more complex, the system needs another layer of security. That's where the bullae come in. A bulla is a hollow clay envelope, something like a small sealed ball or egg. Administrators would gather a set of tokens representing a transaction, say 10 sheep owed from one household to another, due at harvest time, then place them inside a lump of soft clay. They'd roll or press their personal seals on the outside while the clay was still wet, then fire or dry it hard. Now the tokens are locked in. To check the contract, you'd break open the bulla and count the contents. As long as the outer seal impressions are intact, everyone can trust that nothing inside has been quietly removed or added. It's a primitive but surprisingly effective device, a contract written in 3 dimensions. At some point, though, someone has an elegant idea. Instead of enclosing the tokens, why not record them on the outside? By the late Uruk period, we find bullae whose surfaces are covered with small impressed marks and pictorial signs that match the tokens sealed inside. It's an extra record, visible without breaking the envelope. And then gradually the logic flips. People realize you can skip the tokens entirely. Just press or draw the signs into a flat piece of clay, and the information is there without any little counters rattling around. This is how the first tablets appear. Clay patties or rectangles with rows of pictographs, each picture standing for a counted item or person, often accompanied by simple numerical marks. Grain is not represented by a physical cone, but by a drawn one. A sheep is a stylized profile of an animal's head. A jar of oil is a simple vessel shape. The clay tablet has taken over the job of the token hoard and the bulla combined. When scholars decipher these earliest tablets, dating to around 3300–3200 BCE, they're not reading poetry. They're reading lists, ration lists, labour rosters, distribution records. A tablet might record that a group of workers received so many measures of barley and beer over a certain span of time. Another might list deliveries from different villages, each line combining a place name, a quantity, and a commodity sign. Others track herds, or containers of oil and wool moving through temple storerooms. It's the paperwork of an emerging bureaucracy, captured in wet clay. The numerals themselves are still clumsy by our standards. There are different counting systems depending on what is being measured, one set of numerical signs for grain, another for animals, another for land. Values are often shown by repeating or combining simple marks. But the underlying principle is already there. Abstract quantity written beside abstract category, frozen in place so that one person's memory doesn't have to carry the whole burden. From here, the script grows more intricate. Pictographs multiply. New signs appear to specify professions, tools, kinds of labour. Over time, shapes simplify for speed. The graceful pictures turn into more linear forms, easier to impress with the end of a stylus. Scribes begin to press the stylus at different angles, creating the wedge-shaped strokes that give cuneiform, wedge writing, its name. With complexity comes specialization. Not everyone in Uruk can read and write these marks. Literacy is a craft, like metalworking or fine weaving. Children destined for that craft are probably drawn from families already close to the temple or palace administration. They spend years memorizing sign lists, copying out number columns, practicing the standard forms until their fingers and eyes know them without thinking. We find tablets that are essentially exercises, lines of the same sign written over and over, or little lexical lists where a commodity sign in one column is matched with a number of variants or related terms in another. The scribal classroom is born, along with a professional scribal class. While writing is emerging, seals do not disappear. If anything, they become more important. Cylinder seals, small carved stones drilled lengthwise so they can be strung on a cord, are rolled across wet clay to leave a continuous impression. Their designs range from simple geometric patterns to detailed scenes of animals, worshippers, or mythic beasts. When a storage jar is sealed, or a door to a storeroom is plastered shut with clay, the cylinder seal is rolled over it. The impression functions as a signature and a security device. In a world full of strangers, your seal is your identity. You might never meet the person who will eventually open the granary you've just locked, but they will see your seal impression and know which office, which household, which official authorized the transaction. If the seal is broken or a different impression appears, something is wrong. Seals, tokens, bullae, and tablets together form a toolkit for managing trust across distance and time, when face-to-face reassurance isn't always possible. And yet, for all its power, this early writing is narrow. It doesn't try to capture ordinary speech. It doesn't note down jokes told in the weaving workshop or arguments between neighbours over a boundary wall, or lullabies hummed to sleepy children. It doesn't preserve the full sentences priests speak during rituals. It doesn't write down the myths in anything like their later literary form. Part of this is practical. Clay and time are limited. Writing is slow and expensive. Only a handful of people can do it. Those people answer to institutions whose main concerns are property, labour, offerings and obligations. So what gets written is what those institutions care about. Who owes what to whom, what came in and went out, how much of which offerings the gods received on which day. Part of it is conceptual. At this stage, many scholars think writing isn't yet understood as a way to represent language in general. It's a tool for representing things that are countable, categorizable, administratively relevant. A way to externalize certain kinds of memory, not all of it. Only gradually do scribes begin to push the system outward, to use the existing signs in more flexible ways, to represent not just objects but sounds. A sign that once meant arrow can also be used for a syllable that sounds like the Sumerian word for arrow, and by extension for that syllable in other words. Once this phonetic principle is in play, names can be written more precisely. Then bits of spoken language can be captured, then whole phrases. Over centuries, the same script that began as a way to tally grain and beer becomes capable of recording prayers, legal cases, proverbs, hymns, eventually epic poetry. The first known authors in history are Mesopotamian scribes, writing in a script whose earliest ancestors had nothing to do with literature at all. To us, that can feel strange. We tend to think of writing as naturally suited to stories, ideas, the inner life. But in Mesopotamia, as far as we can tell, the order is reversed. The first marks in clay are about obligations, not imagination, about distribution, not daydreams. The poems and myths come later, layered on top of a much older habit, the habit of counting. For now, in the age of Uruk and its immediate successors, clay tablets are still mostly silent on what people feel or believe. They whisper of rations and rosters, harvests and herds, sealed rooms and balanced accounts. The rest of life, the laughter, the songs, the gossip, the private griefs, is carried by voices in courtyards and alleys, vanishing into the night air as soon as they're spoken. Soon, though, the institutions that control labour and grain will also claim something else: the power to speak for the gods and the community in written form. As cities crystallize into city-states As rulers step forward to stand at the head of temples and palaces, writing will be waiting, with its ledgers, its seals, and its newly trained scribes to serve them. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, that earlier world of Uruk and its sister cities has hardened into something more distinct. Now, if you could drift above southern Mesopotamia, following the slow coils of the Euphrates and Tigris, you wouldn't see one great capital dominating everything. You'd see a necklace of cities, each one a little universe. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, Adab, Shuruppak, each with its own walls, its own main temple, its own patron deity, its own proud name for the city, as if no others really counted. Between them stretch fields of barley and emmer, date groves lining the canals, small villages clinging to the edges of the irrigation network. The land is a patchwork of plots, temple lands, palace lands, private holdings, stitched together by dikes and ditches that need constant maintenance. Each city has rulers, but the words the Sumerians use for those rulers are telling. One title is Ensi. It's often translated as governor or city ruler. In some early texts, the Ensi seems closely tied to the city's main god or goddess, a kind of chief steward for the divine household. He doesn't own the city, he manages it on behalf of its patron deity. Another title is Lugal, literally big man. Over time, Lugal comes to mean something closer to king, especially when a ruler claims authority beyond a single city. A Lugal is the one who boasts of victories, commands armies, builds great walls, receives tribute. In practice, the exact powers behind these titles shift from place to place and century to century. In one period, the Ensi of Lagash might be the central figure in both temple and government. In another, a Lugal from Kish might claim to rule the four corners, and demand that other Ensi acknowledge his supremacy. Sometimes the same person holds both roles. Sometimes they're more distinct. What stays fairly constant is the link between kingship and the divine. Rulers don't present themselves as mere strongmen. They are shepherds chosen by the gods, city fathers appointed by heaven. In later royal hymns, a Lugal says that Inanna or Enlil called his name, placed kingship on his head like a crown, measured out his reign on a celestial tablet. Even in earlier, more fragmentary inscriptions, you can feel the same logic. A ruler of Lagash, for instance, will preface his building project by saying he did it for Ningirsu, the city's god, and that Ningirsu granted him victory over Umma in return. The message is simple. Authority flows downward from the divine realm, not upward from human consent. At the literal centre of all this stand the temples. Each city-state revolves around its major cult building, the Iana in Uruk, sacred to Inanna, the Ikur in Nippur, house of Enlil, the temple of Nanna in Ur. These are not just places where priests perform rituals. They're economic engines. Temple estates own fields, orchards, flocks, herds. They employ teams of workers, ploughmen, harvesters, weavers, brewers, millers, boatmen, scribes. They receive offerings and redistribute rations. They store grain against bad years. They lend out seed and tools, then demand repayment after harvest. For an ordinary person, daily life might be woven into this system in quiet, unremarkable ways. If you're a dependent worker, you might spend days in the fields attached to a temple or palace estate. Your pay isn't coins, they don't exist yet, but fixed rations of grain and beer, maybe wool or oil at certain times of year. Clay tablets record you as a number in a labour gang. So many male workers, so many female workers, so many children, so many elderly or disabled dependents. Some people are free householders, farming their own small plots, but even they are tangled in obligations. They pay dues to temple or palace, contribute labour for canal dredging, serve in the army when called up. Debts can accumulate, a bad harvest, a sick ox, a flood at the wrong time, and suddenly you're borrowing grain from a richer neighbour or a temple storehouse. If you can't repay, the tablet contracts tell us what happens. Sons and daughters are pledged as debt servants. A man might sell his child for a term of years, the child becoming legally attached to another household. Other texts mention outright slaves, often prisoners of war or people born into servile status. The line between unfree worker and free but heavily indebted person is sometimes thin. Behind the grand language of kingship and divine favour, there is this harsher reality, a hierarchy of households and institutions, some powerful, some precarious, all dependent on the fragile choreography of water and grain. Water itself is a constant source of tension. Canals are lifelines, but they're also weapons. If your city is upstream and mine is downstream, what happens if you take more than your share? What if you delay opening the sluice gates at planting time, or cut a new branch canal to feed your own fields, leaving mine to dry? The boundary between Lagash and Umur becomes famous in the texts because it's disputed again and again. We have inscriptions where the ruler of Lagash proudly recounts how he restored the border ditches and reclaimed fields he says Umur had seized. In another, he curses anyone who would move the boundary stones in future. The quarrel is not abstract. It's about arable land and control of key canals. Multiply that kind of dispute across a landscape full of small, proud city-states, and you get a recipe for chronic, low-level war. Armies are not yet million-man formations. They're more like extended militias and retinues, spear-armed farmers, a corps of professional soldiers, a few heavy chariots drawn by onagers. Raids and sieges are regular events, but in many cases seem short and brutal rather than world-ending. A neighbouring city's fields are burned. Canal banks are broken. Boundary markers are pulled up and reset farther into enemy territory. Then treaties are made, oaths sworn by the gods of both cities, and life settles back into something like normal until the next dispute. In this restless world, writing slowly expands beyond accounting. We start to see legal documents that look strikingly familiar to a modern reader, even if the details are foreign. Contracts record the sale of land, houses, orchards, even boats. They specify prices in silver by weight, list the witnesses, invoke curses on anyone who would later deny the transaction. Marriage contracts lay out the gifts exchanged between families, the dowry a bride brings, the penalties for divorce. Adoption contracts formalize the taking in of an heir, often with clear obligations. The adopted child must care for the adoptive parents in old age and receive a share of their property. Other texts record court cases. A man alleges that his neighbour moved a boundary stone. Another claims a loan has been repaid. A woman protests that her husband has unjustly repudiated her. Witnesses are called. Oaths are sworn before gods and city officials. Verdicts are written down. There is no single unified law code at this stage that we can point to and say, this was the law of all Sumer. Instead, we see many small snapshots, decisions, contracts, formulae that hint at customary rules. Property is inherited, usually through male lines, but women can own and dispose of property too. Fathers wield strong authority, yet adoption and fosterage complicate simple bloodlines. Slaves can sometimes buy their freedom. Debts can, in some eras, be cancelled by royal decree. Through these fragments, a social world emerges, one where family ties, property rights and obligations are constantly negotiated, but increasingly under the watchful eye of written documents and official seals. Hovering above all this, like a long, uneven dream, is a peculiar text, the Sumerian King List. It's compiled over centuries, probably from different city traditions, and polished into something like a single narrative. It begins before the flood, with a stark claim, when kingship descended from heaven, Kingship was in Eridu. It then lists a series of antediluvian kings with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, kingship rises and falls from city to city, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, and others, each with its roster of rulers and reign lengths. Taken literally, the early parts are fantastical. The reign of a single king lasting 28,800 years is not a historical record in our sense. But the list is not pure fantasy either. As it moves closer to the historical period, some of the kings it names can be cross-checked against contemporary inscriptions and archaeological layers. Names like Mizanepard of Ur or Enmebrejesi of Kish appear both in the king list and on real monuments. So what is this text doing? It's not just counting kings. It's trying to weave together local memories and rival claims into a single story about legitimate rule. Each city has its pride. Each tradition wants to say, we were first, or we held kingship by divine grant. The king list smooths these competing narratives into a sequence. Kingship descends once from heaven, then moves in an orderly progression from city to city, as if guided by an invisible plan. Periods of chaos and overlapping claims are compressed into a neat line. In that sense, the king list is propaganda. It justifies certain ruling houses by anchoring them in a long sacred chain. It suggests that kingship is not something seized, but something conferred temporarily on a given city, then taken away and bestowed elsewhere. At the same time, it's also a kind of collective memory, trying to preserve the echo of real rulers and real upheavals. Under the impossible numbers and theological framing, you can sense the effort to remember who came before, how long they ruled, and where kingship belonged at different times. Temple ledgers, labour rosters, court cases, marriage contracts, king lists. Together, they show a world where human power is becoming more formal, more layered, more justified in writing and myth. The Ensi and Lugal stand at the point where irrigation ditches, temple storerooms, and the will of the gods all supposedly meet. Below them, people weed fields, haul bricks, negotiate dowries, and whisper about boundary stones moved by night. And above them, in the stories that are only beginning to crystallize, the gods themselves argue love, rage, and bestow kingship like a mantle. Those stories, the myths and the worldview that gave all this structure a cosmic meaning, are the next layer of Mesopotamia's memory. In this world of barley fields, boundary stones, and temple ledgers, the gods are not far away abstractions. They are landlords, they are employers, they are, in a strange way, neighbours. Each city thinks of itself as the seat of a particular deity. Uruk belongs to Inanna, Nippur belongs to Enlil, Eridu looks to Enki. Hur is the city of the moon god Nanna. Sippar honours the sun god Utu. The match isn't perfect, and it changes over time, but the pattern is consistent. City and god form a pair. The temple at the city's centre is not just a house of prayer. It is literally the god's house, conceived on the model of an elite household. The god has fields, flocks, servants, storehouses. The god has a bedroom and a dining room. Priests speak of washing and dressing the god in the morning, feeding the god at regular times, putting the god to bed at night. Daily offerings, bread, beer, meat, dates, incense, are prepared and laid out in carefully prescribed quantities. Not because anyone expects the statue to actually chew and swallow, but because in ritual terms the god eats. The aroma, the act, the words surrounding it, are what sustain the divine presence. Humans in this view exist to keep the divine household running. Some creation stories say this openly. The gods, tired of digging canals and doing menial labour themselves, decide they need workers. Humans are formed out of clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. They are made to bear the yoke that the gods no longer wish to carry. In other versions, humans are created to maintain temples, to bring offerings, to chant praise, to build and repair. The logic is straightforward. The universe is a great hierarchy of households. At the top are the gods with their own invisible city, their own assembly. Below them are kings and great families. Below them lesser households and dependents. Each level owes service upward and receives protection downward. When this chain is honoured, the world makes sense. When it is broken, chaos leaks in. Chaos, in Mesopotamian thought, is not just messiness. It has teeth. It's the flood that wipes out fields and villages. It's the storm that shatters dikes and sends canal water tearing into houses. It's the wild steppe encroaching on farmland, the howling desert beyond the last irrigated plot. In one famous Babylonian creation story, the one we know from later copies as the Enuma Elish, chaos is personified as Tiamat, the great salt water, the primordial sea. The young god Marduk fights and defeats her, splits her body like a shellfish, and from her carcass fashions heaven and earth. The implication is stark. Order is built out of a violent conquest of chaos and must constantly be defended. Older Sumerian traditions tell different tales, but the theme repeats. There is a flood sent by the gods, perhaps because humans have become too noisy or too numerous. One man, warned in advance, called Ziusudra in Sumerian, Utnapishtim in Akkadian, builds a boat, saves seeds and animals, and rides out the deluge. When he offers sacrifice afterward, the gods gather around like flies, hungry for offerings they no longer receive from drowned humanity. They regret their excess and agree to new arrangements. Chaos can also be social: war, rebellion, kings who rule unjustly, cities that neglect their gods. In stories, when a king forgets his obligations, the gods can withdraw their favour. Enlil might turn his face away. Inanna might abandon the city. In narrative terms, that means famine, invasion, dynasties wiped out. But the gods are not a single unified will. They have personalities, rivalries, histories of their own. Enlil, the great air god of Nippur, is often imagined as a kind of cosmic executive. He convenes the divine assembly. He decrees destinies, a phrase that suggests setting out the pattern for seasons, kingship, the length of a person's life. Enki, or Ea in later Akkadian, is different. He is the god of fresh water, wisdom and cunning, associated especially with Eridu in the south. In myths he knows secret names, understands the hidden structure of things, and often plays the role of the clever fixer. When the flood is coming, it is Enki who whispers the warning. When strict decrees threaten to crush humans, it is often Enki who finds a loophole. Then there is Inanna, or Ishtar in Akkadian, patroness of Uruk, goddess of love and war, sexuality, and political power. Her stories are some of the most vivid. In one, she descends to the underworld, passing through 7 gates, stripping off garments and ornaments at each one, until she stands naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Inanna is judged, struck down, and hung on a hook. The world above withers in her absence. Eventually, through intricate deals and substitutions, she returns, but not without cost. The story is strange, layered, possibly connected to seasonal cycles, possibly to royal rituals of power and vulnerability. In another story, Inanna goes to Enki's city and plies him with drink. As he grows drunk, she persuades him to hand over the me, a mysterious set of divine attributes or decrees that govern civilization itself: kingship, truth, weaving, lamentation, music, even prostitution. She loads these onto her boat and brings them to Uruk, making her city the centre of culture. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he has lost, he sends messengers to retrieve the me, but Inanna fends them off. In the end he accepts the transfer. Underneath the playful, almost comedic surface, there is a serious statement. religious imagination is tracking real shifts in power. As centuries pass, the balance among gods changes. Early on, Enlil in Nippur is a central figure, a kind of anchor. In different periods, Inanna's prominence grows, reflecting Uruk's prestige. Later, especially under Babylonian hegemony, Marduk begins to rise, absorbing roles once held by Enlil and others. Hymns and myths are rewritten or reinterpreted, so that Marduk becomes the hero of creation, the holder of the tablets of destiny. The divine order is not static, it bends under the weight of politics and regional pride. At ground level, though, what matters to most people is less the grand theological reshuffling and more the immediate web of obligations. You bring offerings because the gods must eat. You repair the temple roof because leaks would dishonour the deity. You perform particular rituals at New Year, at planting, at harvest, at eclipses, at births and deaths, because that is how you help keep the world's precarious order in place. Yet you never feel entirely safe. The rivers can still rise too high. A child can still fall ill. An enemy can still ambush a caravan. So Mesopotamian culture puts enormous energy into a different project, trying to read the future. Divination is everywhere. It is a whole science with its own specialists, its own libraries of precedent. When a lamb or ox is sacrificed, the liver is carefully examined. Its lobes, markings and shapes are read like a text. Clay models of livers survive, covered in labelled zones. If this part is swollen, it means X will happen. If that part is cut, it means Y. The sky is another tablet the gods write on. Priests track the movements of the moon and planets, note eclipses, record the appearance of unusual stars. Over generations, they build up thick series of omen collections. If an eclipse occurs on this day in this month, it means the king will be safe, but the harvest will fail. If Venus rises in such and such a position, a great king will die. Even small signs are catalogued. A birth defect in a calf, the way smoke curls from a fire, the pattern of oil poured onto water, each can be read against an archive of thousands of recorded cases. There is a logic to this. In a world where the gods decree destinies, they might also hint at what they have decided. Omens are not exactly causes, they are indicators. If you can read them correctly, maybe you can act in time, cancel a risky campaign, delay a building project, perform an extra ritual to avert disaster. Kings take this seriously. Letters survive from Assyrian and Babylonian rulers consulting diviners, demanding clarification, commissioning fresh readings when signs are ambiguous. Sometimes they even institute substitute king rituals, placing a stand-in on the throne to absorb a predicted doom, while the real king temporarily steps aside. But even this elaborate system has limits. The gods can send conflicting signs. Different diviners can interpret the same liver in different ways. And, importantly, the gods themselves are not bound by omens. A deity might change their mind. They might accept a ritual as sufficient payment or not. So myth and ritual, for all their power, never create an airtight control over life. They create a sense of structure, a language for talking about misfortune and success, a way to integrate political events into a cosmic story. When a city rises, its god is said to have taken kingship. When it falls, its god is said to have abandoned it or handed its rule to another. When a ruler undertakes a massive building project or issues a decree cancelling debts, he likes to present it as obedience to divine instruction. The gods told him to make justice shine, to restore temples, to fix canals. Yet everyone also knows at some level that ambitious men maneuver, that armies march, that boundary stones are moved by hands in the night. The stories do not erase this awareness. They wrap it. They say, yes, kings fight and scheme, but above them the gods argue and bargain too. Yes, Floods come and harvests fail, but perhaps that is because a ritual was neglected, a promise broken, or simply because the divine household decided to tighten the leash. In this way, the Mesopotamian worldview stretches from the grain ration in a worker's hand to the most distant star. Everything is, in theory, connected. The crack on a sheep's liver, the fall of a dynasty, the love affair of a goddess, the course of the planet Venus. For the people who lived along the Tigris and Euphrates, this was not an abstract philosophy. It was the air they breathed, and into this dense web of gods and omens, another kind of power is about to step. The first figures to claim not just to rule a city, but to weld many cities into something like an empire. When people in later ages told the story, they liked to start with a baby in a basket. They said a priestess of high rank, forbidden to bear children, secretly gave birth to a son. To save his life, she sealed him in a reed box, coated it with bitumen, and set it adrift on the river. The basket floated down to a gardener drawing water. He lifted the crying infant from the current and raised him as his own. One day this foundling would become king over the 4 quarters of the world. His name, they said, was Sargon of Akkad. You can hear an echo there of another story, written much later about another river and another baby. Legends like this like to rhyme with each other. They compress complex changes into simple, memorable images. A helpless infant born by the current of fate, plucked up and set on a path to greatness. Strip away the legend, and what we can actually see is still remarkable. Somewhere in northern Babylonia, probably sometime around 2350 BCE, a figure named Sargon, Shahrukhin, the true king, or the legitimate king, takes power in a city called Akkad. We don't actually know where Akkad was. Archaeologists have never found it with certainty. Later texts place it between other known places, somewhere along the middle Euphrates-Tigris region, but the exact mound remains unproven. An imperial capital that dominated Mesopotamia for over a century has, for now, dissolved back into the landscape. What we do have are Sargon's royal inscriptions, copied and recopied for centuries. They present a man who begins as cupbearer to the king of Kish, a trusted official in another northern city, then turns against his master, wins battles, and is granted kingship by the goddess Ishtar. They record campaigns down the Euphrates, up into the Zagros, west toward the Mediterranean. They speak of washing his weapons in the sea, of subduing 30-something kings, of placing his own daughter as high priestess in Ur. How much of this is literally true, and how much is later embellishment, is debated. But the broad outline is likely. A northern warlord, perhaps of relatively humble origin, leverages military success and religious patronage to break the old pattern of city-state rivalry. Before Sargon, kings fought and sometimes dominated their neighbours. We hear of kings of Kish claiming precedence, of rulers like Lugal-Zagezi boasting that Enlil has given them all the lands from the upper to the lower sea. Yet their control seems to have been loose, episodic, a web of victories, alliances and vassals that could fray quickly. With Akkad, something harder appears. Sargon and his successors do not just raid. They hold. They plant garrisons in conquered cities. They appoint governors, often with Akkadian names, to oversee local affairs. They issue standardized administrative texts. They boast not only of victory, but of how long the land has remained at peace under their great net. For the first time in Mesopotamian history, we can talk with some caution about a territorial empire. Not an empire like Rome, with paved roads and marble capitals, but a network of cities, outposts and subject regions linked by military presence, shared bureaucracy, and a king who claims universal rule, not just over one city and its god, but over many. This is Sargon's revolution. Part of that revolution is administrative. In earlier Sumerian city-states, power centers on temple households and palace households, each with their own accounting systems. Under the Akkadians, There is still variety. No ancient administration is completely uniform, but we begin to see more standardized practices. Tablets from different regions show similar formats for recording grain, labor, rations. Officials in far-flung cities use equivalent titles. Seals of Akkadian appointees turn up guarding storehouses and contracts in places that once had purely local elites. The king at the top is no longer just shepherd of city name. He is king of Akkad, sometimes king of the four quarters. Under him, an array of Shakanaku and Ensi governors and ruling officials manage provinces on his behalf. Garrison troops, often drawn from various subject peoples, sit in strategic locations, ready to intervene if tax flows falter or a local ruler grows restless. This kind of system requires information. Messengers have to cross hundreds of kilometers with reports about harvests, troop movements, temple projects. Orders have to move the other way, sometimes in emergencies, sometimes as routine instructions to adjust labor quotas or canal maintenance. A bad decision in the capital can now starve people in a distant town weeks or months later. In this expanding zone of imperial paperwork, language itself is shifting. For centuries, Sumerian has been the dominant written language in southern Mesopotamia. It may or may not have been widely spoken outside certain regions, but it is the prestige tongue of temple hymns, legal formulas, royal inscriptions. The people who build Akkad, though, are speakers of a different language, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue more closely related to later Babylonian and Assyrian. In Sargon's time, Akkadian and Sumerian coexist. Scribes are bilingual. Many texts are still composed in Sumerian, sometimes with Akkadian translations or glosses added. But the balance is tilting. Akkadian becomes increasingly common in royal inscriptions, in diplomatic correspondence, in administrative notes. You can imagine scribes in schools copying out Sumerian proverbs and hymns as classical literature, while also learning Akkadian for everyday use. The script, cuneiform, remains, but the language flowing through it changes. It's as if Latin and a rising Romance language overlapped, with priests and scholars clinging to the old idiom, while merchants, soldiers and officials shift toward the new. The Akkadian Empire, in this sense, is not just a political project, but a linguistic one. It helps create a world in which Sumerian will eventually become a learned liturgical language, while Akkadian, in its regional dialects, becomes the main voice of law, administration and myth. Sargon's own legend grows in proportion to this transformation. Centuries after his death, scribes are still copying out tales about his miraculous birth, his clever stratagems, his daring campaigns. They picture him marching with only a few trusty companions into hostile lands, surviving assassination plots, communing with Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war. The stories say he ruled for 55 years, that his empire reached from the upper sea to the lower sea. They say that 5,400 men ate at his table daily. Some of these numbers are almost certainly symbolic, expressing abundance and scope rather than audited fact. But the persistence of the stories tells us something. Later, Mesopotamians looked back to Sargon as a prototype of the conquering king. And then came a grandson who pushed that image even further. Naram-Sin, one of the most famous Akkadian rulers, inherits a realm knit together by 2 generations of conquest and reorganization. He faces rebellions almost immediately. An inscription known as the Curse of Akkad composed later pictures, the 4 quarters rising against him all at once, a storm of cities seeking to break free. Whether this particular revolt happened exactly as described is uncertain, but the pattern is familiar in all empires. The larger the territory, the more fronts on which things can go wrong. Naram-Sin crushes his enemies. In one famous monument, the victory stela of Naram-Sin, he is shown towering over defeated foes, wearing a horned helmet traditionally reserved for gods. His figure strides up a mountain larger than life, while tiny soldiers swarm below. This is new. Earlier kings, even when pious and powerful, present themselves as servants of the gods, chosen by them, acting under their gaze. Naram-Sin begins to blur that line. In some inscriptions he is called the god of Akkad. Temples are dedicated to him. He receives offerings alongside older deities. You can feel a shift in the mental landscape. If the king is himself divine, then obedience to him is not just political, it is religious. His victories confirm not only that his city's god is strong, but that he personally is woven into the fabric of cosmic order. His failures, when they come, will be harder to explain away. This daring elevation of kingship is part of the Akkadian experiment. It will echo down through later ages, influencing how rulers in Mesopotamia and beyond imagine their own status. But it also hints at a kind of overreach, because under all the glory, the empire is fragile. Its roads are long, its supply lines follow rivers that can shift or silt up. Armies must be fed, garrisons paid, loyalists rewarded. Grain moved from one region to another can spoil, be stolen, or be blocked by local resistance. Mountains on the eastern frontier are home to groups who do not farm in the same way, who are harder to tax, who know the terrain better than any lowland soldier. Rebellions flare not only in distant lands, but in old Sumerian cities, where local elites resent northern overlords, and where memories of earlier autonomy still burn. Droughts or crop failures in one sector ripple through the whole system, weakening the centre's ability to project force. Letters from slightly later periods give us a feel for this constant strain. Governors beg for more troops or complain that they have not received rations. Local officials warn that the people of the land are restless. Borders are not lines on a clear map, but zones of contested influence, where caravan routes can be harassed and vassals can switch sides. Akkad's dominance lasts perhaps a century, maybe a bit more depending on how you count. In human terms, that's 2 or 3 generations, long enough for grandchildren to grow up knowing no other order, short enough that elders can still remember a time when their city bowed to no northern king. When it ends, it will end in a tangle of internal weakness and external pressure, rebellions, rival claimants, and a new enemy pressing in from the highlands with their own gods, their own kings, and their own ideas about what Mesopotamia should be. But that is another chapter for now. In the deep night of history, you can picture the Akkadian experiment at its height. A web of canals and roads tying together lands that had once been separate worlds, a new language rising alongside an old one, a king daring to wear the horns of a god, and beneath it all, the same old rivers flowing on, indifferent to human dreams of all-encompassing rule. The new enemy from the highlands appears in later stories like a bad dream. They called them Gutians, mountain people from the Zagros to the east. In Sumerian laments, the Gutians are blamed for everything. They are people who know no barley, who do not know how to eat bread, men who have no sense and do not know how to revere the gods. They sweep down like a sandstorm, lay waste to cities, ruin fields, tear down walls. It's hard to separate rhetoric from reality. Ancient urban elites almost always talk this way about people from the hills and steppes. To a scribe in a lowland city, someone who doesn't farm the way you do, who doesn't speak your language, who doesn't write, can feel like the embodiment of chaos. When things go wrong, drought, disease, rebellion, it's tempting to say, the barbarians did it. Archaeologically, the picture is murkier. We do find traces of disruption in the late Akkadian period, abandoned settlements, fortifications breached, a sense that long-distance connections are fraying. There are kings who claim in their inscriptions to have defeated Gutian rulers, to have driven out the Gutian nation from Sumer and Akkad, so there were definitely highland groups pushing into the lowlands, raiding, maybe even ruling some cities for a time. But the fall of Akkad and the age that follows look less like a simple Gutian conquest, and more like a long, uneven unravelling. The big imperial net breaks. No single king can any longer command all the four quarters. Instead, you see a patchwork return. Old cities reasserting themselves, local dynasties emerging, each claiming to have restored order in its own corner. Down in the deep south, in cities like Uruk, Lagash, and especially something interesting happens. Amid the uncertainty, amid the memory of Akkad's reach and its collapse, local rulers start experimenting with a new kind of state. One of them, a king named Nama of will later be praised for having secured justice in the land. He and his successors will be known, by modern scholars, as the Third Dynasty of III for short. If you imagine Akkad as one of the first attempts at a sprawling, militarized empire, you can picture III as one of the first attempts at an intensely managed bureaucratic state. We know this not from grand monuments, but from something quieter, paperwork. From the time of Nama and his son Shulgi, around 2100 BCE, southern Mesopotamia begins to produce clay tablets in astonishing numbers. Not just royal inscriptions and hymns, but everyday records. Ration lists, labour assignments, warehouse receipts, accounts for sheep, goats, fish, reeds, metal tools, textiles, boats. Tens of thousands of these have survived, maybe hundreds of thousands once existed. They come from temples, from royal estates, from provincial offices. Taken together, they show a world in which the palace at and its allied temples try to bring as much of economic life as possible under formal recorded control. Here's how that looked on the ground. Imagine you're a worker attached to a temple household under III. You might be part of a labour gang digging a canal, harvesting grain, weaving cloth, or herding animals. You are not necessarily enslaved, but you are obligated by debt, by duty, by law, to perform work on behalf of the institution. In return, you receive rations, barley, oil, sometimes beer or wool, measured out according to your status, age and role. One tablet might list so many litres of barley for the men, smaller amounts for women, perhaps half rations for children. Another tablet tracks how many days of labour each person has completed, how many remain owed. Above you is a hierarchy of overseers, scribes and administrators, all of them using cuneiform to keep the system running. They count workers in and out. They record how much grain comes in from each field, how much is retained for seed, how much is milled, baked or distributed. They note shortages, surpluses and missing items. This is not a market economy in the modern sense. Prices and contracts exist, but a huge part of production is organized through this redistributive network. The state and temples collect, store and reallocate. To make this possible, the III kings cultivate an image of themselves as guarantors of cosmic and social order. After the confusion of the Gutian time, they present their reign as a carefully arranged restoration. Nama and Shulgi rebuild temples that had fallen into disrepair. They rededicate sanctuaries in cities across Sumer, emphasizing their piety toward the whole Mesopotamian pantheon, not just the god of They repair city walls, dig or clear canals, standardize weights and measures. In their inscriptions they speak of setting the land in proper order, of re-establishing righteous judgments, of making sure the orphan and the widow receive protection. One of the earliest known law collections in history, preserved under Nama's name, promises fixed fines for certain offences, a schedule of penalties designed to prevent feuds from spiralling out of control. Shulgi in particular leans hard into royal ideology. He boasts of being a scholar, a musician, a runner, a mighty warrior. He claims to have inspected canals personally, to have overseen judicial decisions, to have kept the calendar in proper alignment with the stars. In cultic texts he is sometimes praised in language that verges on the divine. It is as if after the daring divinization of Naram-Sin and the chaos that followed, the kings of are trying to thread a careful line, exalted, semi-sacred, but primarily as restorers and keepers of order. Their order, though, depends on reaching far beyond Sumer's own fields. Southern Mesopotamia has always lacked certain key resources. In the Ur-III period, the need for metals, stone and timber becomes even more pressing. The centralized state wants to equip armies, build monumental architecture, produce fine goods for temples and the royal court. These require copper and tin for bronze, silver for payments and offerings, cedar and other strong woods for roofs and doors, lapis lazuli and carnelian for jewellery, fine wool and textiles for export. So the kings of Ur cultivate trade routes, like lifelines. To the east, caravans and river traffic connect Ur to Elam and further into the Iranian plateau, bringing metals, stone and luxury items, sending back wool, grain and manufactured goods. To the north and northwest, routes reach toward the middle Euphrates, to cities that will later be part of the old Babylonian and Assyrian worlds. To the Gulf, ships sail from ports near Ur down toward Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and beyond, tapping into networks that reach as far as Oman and the Indus Valley. Some of these traders work directly for the crown or temples. Others seem to be private merchants operating under royal licenses or in partnership with institutional investors. In either case, the tablets show a constant movement of goods, credits, and obligations. The bureaucracy at home depends on this flow to keep its rations generous, its construction projects supplied, its gods properly adorned. For a time it works. Under Ur-Namma Shulgi and their immediate successors, Ur-III rules a broad swath of southern Mesopotamia and exerts influence beyond. Provincial governors, often relatives or trusted officials, administer cities in the king's name. They send in taxes, labour and troops. They receive royal instructions and participate in state festivals. Scribal schools refine Sumerian literature, copying and composing hymns, proverbs and narratives that will shape Mesopotamian culture for centuries. But, as before, strain accumulates. Inside the system, the very intensity of bureaucratic control may create tensions. When rations are cut, when corvée labour demands feel excessive, when local officials abuse their power, resentment builds. Some tablets hint at shortages and overburdened workers, at arrears and creative accounting. Outside, new forces are pressing. To the west and northwest, groups like the Amorites, West Semitic-speaking peoples, move gradually into the Euphrates basin. Some come peacefully as pastoralists and settlers, hiring themselves out as soldiers or labourers, integrating into city life. Others appear in texts as raiders. Over time, Amorite leaders begin to carve out their own little domains, sometimes serving as governors under Ur, sometimes asserting more autonomy. To the east, the old highland neighbour Elam watches and waits. Elamite rulers have long interacted with Mesopotamian cities as trading partners, rivals and occasional overlords. They know the lowlands are rich but vulnerable. As the reigns after Shulgi unfold, the king's ability to keep this complex machine tuned seems to falter. There are signs of revolts in outlying provinces. Governors become more independent. The reach of routine administration shrinks. A bad year in one region now has more trouble being compensated by surpluses from another. Eventually the pressures converge. Amorite groups grow more powerful on the western and northern fringes. Elamite armies push in from the east. In one later text, the last king of Ur, Ibi-Sin, is pictured as trapped in his city, increasingly isolated, watching as the countryside slips away. Grain prices soar. The royal house can no longer meet its obligations. Allies defect. Enemies close in. Around 2000 BCE, Elamite forces sack Ur. The city's great ziggurat and temples are damaged. The royal dynasty ends. The bureaucratic apparatus that had once monitored every handful of barley in its core domains collapses. Sumerian poets respond with laments, haunting texts that describe the gods abandoning their temples, the storm of destruction sweeping through, the people scattered. They frame it as the result of divine anger, a cosmic decision that the kingship of should come to an end. Yet if you zoom out, you don't see an apocalypse. You see a reshaping. Cities do not vanish. Itself will be rebuilt and reoccupied. Other centres, Izin, Larsa, Babylon, Eshnunna, Mari, rise to prominence in the generations that follow. Amorite warlords become kings, taking old titles and honouring old gods while tracing their own lineages and heroes. Elam remains a powerful neighbour, sometimes an enemy, sometimes a patron. The fall of III marks the end of a particular vision, a highly centralised ration-distributing, temple-centred Sumerian state that tried to manage society through tablets and measures. In its place emerges a more fragmented landscape of city kingdoms, each with its own blend of Sumerian and Akkadian culture, its own memories of Akkad, Gutium, and its own way of telling the story of what was lost and what was restored. Identities shift. Sumerian, increasingly, becomes a learned language of ritual and scholarship, while Akkadian dominates everyday speech and administration. The idea of Sumer and Akkad as a combined cultural space takes root. People remember the kings of as exemplars of justice and piety, even as new dynasties rework what justice and piety mean in practice. The rivers still flow between their banks. Canals are dug and redone. Fields are sown. Children grow up in cities whose walls have been rebuilt more than once, hearing tales of Gutians and glorious kings, of laments and restorations. Collapse in Mesopotamia is rarely an end. It is a turning of the wheel. And as that wheel turns from to new centres, another city on the Middle Euphrates begins, slowly, to gather stories around its name, a place called Babylon, and a king who will try to write his laws into the very fabric of his realm. When fell, it did not leave a vacuum so much as a mosaic. Across the alluvium and up along the rivers, power broke into pieces. Cities that had once answered to now answered mostly to themselves or to whoever could seize the gates and persuade the gods. Izin and Larsa in the south, Eshnunna to the northeast, Mari out on the middle Euphrates, and in between and among them, lesser-known places, Kish, Sippar, countless towns and canal-side villages, each with its own ruler, its own council of elders, its own scribes pressing wedges into clay. Many of the men who rose to kingship in this time trace their ancestry not to old Sumerian lines, but to Amorite clans, West Semitic-speaking groups, whose forebears had grazed flocks on the fringes of the irrigated land. In 3 days, Amorites had been shepherds, soldiers, hired hands, and sometimes raiders. Now their chiefs settled down, married into local elites, took throne names in Akkadian, and claimed the ancient title King of the Four Quarters or simply Shepherd of the People. The result, in the centuries around 1900 to 1700 BCE, is what historians call the Old Babylonian period, a landscape of competing city kingdoms, their rulers all reading and writing the same cuneiform script, praying to the same gods, reciting many of the same hymns, but each manoeuvring for an edge. They make treaties and break them. They exchange daughters in marriage, then send troops when the alliance frays. They call one another brother in letters, while plotting to redirect a canal that will starve a rival's fields. Into this crowded, dangerous, strangely familiar world steps a king of a not yet remarkable city on the middle Euphrates, Hammurabi of Babylon. When Hammurabi comes to the throne, Babylon is not the obvious candidate for greatness. It is one city among many, under pressure from larger neighbours. To the south, Larsa is strong. To the east, Eshnunna controls rich agricultural zones and key routes. To the north, Ashur and other cities watch the trade to Anatolia. In the west, Mari sits like a toll booth on the Euphrates traffic. Hammurabi's first moves look cautious. He repairs defences, strengthens canals, honours temples. He writes devout inscriptions about serving the gods and protecting the weak. On paper, he appears as yet another pious city king promising order. But behind the piety is careful timing. He makes alliances when he is weak, and waits while stronger powers exhaust themselves fighting one another. He cultivates ties with distant kings through letters and gift exchanges, building a web of diplomacy in which Babylon appears respectful, modest, unthreatening. Then, gradually, he begins to pick off rivals. He intervenes in disputes as a helper and leaves his garrisons behind. He exploits the death of one king here, a rebellion there, to step in as guarantor of order. Wars that begin as limited campaigns against border towns end with Babylonian control over whole regions. Over a reign of more than 40 years, Babylon grows from a middling city-state into the core of a large kingdom that stretches over much of southern and central Mesopotamia. Later tradition exaggerates his conquests, but the basic pattern holds. Hammurabi rides the currents of the old Babylonian patchwork and, for a moment, draws many of its pieces into his orbit. Today, though, his name is most often attached not to his wars, but to a stone monument, a tall, dark stele, inscribed with hundreds of lines of Akkadian, often called the Code of Hammurabi. At the top, the king stands before the sun god and judge Shamash, receiving a rod and ring, symbols of authority and right measurement. Below, column after column of wedge-shaped signs lay out cases and consequences. If a man puts out the eye of another man, they shall put out his eye. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, that builder shall be put to death. It can look, at first glance, like a modern law code, a neat, comprehensive set of rules for a whole country. But scholars tend to see it differently. The text is not a list of statutes that judges mechanically apply. It is a collection of legal scenarios, if this then that, framed by long prologues and epilogues in which Hammurabi boasts of establishing justice, protecting widows and orphans, and rooting out the evil and wicked. Many of the cases are highly specific. They refer to particular kinds of contracts, property arrangements, and social ranks. Some rules even conflict with other known practices from Hammurabi's own time. Courts could and did decide differently depending on witnesses, written contracts, and local custom. So what was this code doing? One way to think of it is as royal propaganda in legal form, a public statement of ideology. It broadcasts a vision of society where the king stands at the centre of a pyramid of obligations, where offences have measured, predictable penalties instead of spiralling vengeance, where each social group, lords, commoners, dependents, slaves, has its recognised place. It probably also served as a teaching text. Copies of Hammurabi's Law Stele turn up centuries after his death, in scribal schools far from Babylon. Students practice sections of it the way they practice proverbs and hymns. To learn the code is to learn how a respectable old Babylonian legal mind thinks, how to translate messy human conflict into formulaic categories and outcomes. If you step away from the monument and look at the clay tablets from Hammurabi's Babylon and his neighbours, you see law in practice. There are records of real court cases, disputes over fields, accusations of theft, questions about inheritance. Parties appear before elders or royal judges. Witnesses testify. Oaths are sworn by the life of the king and by the gods. Decisions are written down and sealed. Contracts are everywhere. Marriage agreements spell out what the bride brings. What happens if one partner dies? What support a wife must receive if her husband takes another woman? Adoption documents record adults taking in children, or even other adults, not only for care but for labour and inheritance purposes. A couple without sons might adopt a stranger on the condition that he support them in old age and perform their funeral rites. Debt looms large as well. Farmers borrow grain or silver before harvest. pledging fields, labour, or family members as security. If harvests fail, obligations mount. Some tablets show whole households sliding into semi-dependent status, offering themselves as servants to a great house or temple to work off what they owe. Others record royal or city-wide debt releases, in which a king proclaims the cancellation of certain debts, the freeing of people pledged for loans, the return of foreclosed land. These acts of cleaning the slate are both practical and symbolic. They relieve social pressure, preventing too many citizens from becoming debt-burdened dependents of a few powerful creditors. And they reinforce the image of the king as restorer of balance, as someone who can, by decree, reset the economic game. In this world, social status is written into the very language of the tablets. People are labelled as a wilu, fully free persons with certain rights and penalties, or as lesser-ranked commoners, or as slaves. The same injury to the body carries different consequences depending on who is injured and who is responsible. Fines and compensations scale with rank. Yet the presence of contracts, of lawsuits brought by women, of adoptions that cross status lines, suggests that the reality on the ground could be more fluid than the neat categories imply. Hovering over all of this, like a quiet background hum, is the scribal culture that makes it legible. In Hammurabi's time, Sumerian is no longer the language most people speak at home. Akkadian dominates conversation and administration. But in schools attached to temples and elite houses, young scribes still copy Sumerian myths, hymns and proverbs, line after painstaking line. They learn lists, signs, words, professions, cities, gods. They recite model contracts and letters. They imitate older compositions from and earlier, then compose new prayers and stories in similar styles. Through their hands, an earlier Sumerian world is preserved, reorganized, and folded into an Amorite Akkadian present. Babylon benefits enormously from this continuity. As Hammurabi and his successors expand their influence, Babylon's god Marduk rises in prominence. Liturgy and myth are reworked so that Marduk is not just another city god, but a cosmic champion, taking on roles formerly reserved for older deities. The great creation story that later tradition associates with Babylon casts him as the one who tames primordial chaos and organizes the universe. Even after Hammurabi's line weakens and other powers chip away at Babylon's territory, something has changed. The city has become more than a political capital. It is a cultural reference point. Its scribes, its god, its legal models, its myths exert a kind of gravitational pull. Later, Assyrian kings will conquer Babylon and then take pains to present themselves as its legitimate protectors. Later foreign rulers will boast of restoring its walls and temples as if that alone confers Mesopotamian kingship. Empires rise and fall, borders twist and blur, but the idea of Babylon endures, a name that for more than 1,000 years after Hammurabi will continue to mean power, learning, and the dense, complicated order of life between the two rivers. As the old Babylonian era unfolds, caravans and messengers move constantly between these cities and far beyond, carrying copper and tin, news and letters, prayers and threats. The land between the rivers is no longer an isolated cradle. It is one node in a wider Bronze Age web. A web will follow next, out along the trade routes and into the deserts and seas that surround Mesopotamia. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in a land rich and poor at the same time. The mud was endless. Clay for bricks, for tablets, for sealing jars and building cities lay right underfoot. The rivers brought silt for fields. Reeds grew thick in the marshes. But if you wanted anything that did not grow out of mud or grain or cattle, if you wanted hard stone for statues and grinding tools, tall timbers for roofs, metals for weapons and jewellery, you had a problem. The alluvial plain had almost none of these. There were no cedar forests by Babylon, no copper mines outside no rich tin veins beneath the canals of Lhasa. to build temples and palaces, to arm soldiers, to craft the luxury goods that announced a king's greatness. Mesopotamia needed the mountains, deserts, and coasts that surrounded it. So from very early on, the cities of the two rivers were tied to a larger world by threads of trade. Those threads were not abstract. They ran through the lives of very specific people, merchant families. We meet them on the tablets. A man in Sippar sends his son to Mari with silver and dyed woolens. A woman in Lhasa advances grain to a caravan and takes a share of the profits. Brothers in Ashur form a partnership to ship tin and textiles north into Anatolia, where other tablets in other archives record their arrival. These merchants are not humble peddlers with a few trinkets on a donkey. Many belong to substantial lineages. They own houses, fields, and depots. They know scribes by name, because they need contracts that will stand up in court thousands of kilometers away. They also know risk intimately. Moving goods in the Bronze Age meant exposing them to almost everything that could go wrong. Bandits, bad weather, dishonest partners, sick animals, sudden wars, closed city gates. To cope, merchant families developed systems that in some ways feel strikingly modern. They use credit. One man supplies silver to another, who uses it to buy copper in the Gulf. The silver lender gets repaid later. Not in coins. Coinage is still far in the future here, but by weight of metal or in other goods. Rates of interest are carefully recorded. Deadlines are spelled out. Collateral is named. A field, a house, a share in a ship, sometimes even the labour of a family member. They form partnerships. 2 or more merchants pool resources to mount a caravan or outfit a vessel. One partner might stay in the home city, managing accounts and dealing with officials. Another travels with the goods. Profits and losses are split according to formulas agreed in advance. The tablets describe these arrangements with technical vocabulary: house of trade, account of silver, partnership tablets, sealed and witnessed by multiple parties. If a shipment vanishes, the contract matters. Did the travelling partner take reasonable precautions? Did he deviate from the agreed route? Did he insure the cargo with a third party? They hedge their bets. Instead of putting everything into one big, risky expedition, they scatter investments. A single wealthy household might have a stake in ships to Dilmun in the Gulf, in donkey caravans toward the Levant, and in tin shipments bound for the Anatolian plateau. If pirates hit one route or war flares up along another, perhaps a third still pays. Follow these merchants and you find the routes that draw Mesopotamia into the wider Bronze Age. To the north and northwest lies Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. There, in mountain valleys, are sources of silver, copper, and later iron. Assyrian merchants in particular build a network of trading colonies known from places like Kultepe. They live in their own quarters, keep their own records, and send home detailed letters about prices, taxes, and local politics. To the west, along the Euphrates, and out into the Levant, routes run towards cities in what is now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel-Palestine. Mari sits astride one of these paths, a kind of giant customs station and diplomatic hub. Beyond, cedar forests in the Lebanon mountains provide the great timbers so prized in southern Mesopotamia, floated down to coastal ports and then carried inland. To the southeast is the Gulf. Far downriver from and later Babylon, ships cross to Dilmun, probably centred on Bahrain, and nearby coasts. Dilmun becomes a key middleman. From there goods can go on to Magan on the Omani coast with its copper and stone, and even farther to the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Indus seals and beads show up in Mesopotamian layers. Mesopotamian cylinder seals and texts mention foreign woods and exotic products arriving from lands over the sea. Moving along these routes is slow, physical work on land. The standard vehicle is not a cart, but a donkey caravan. Donkeys can handle rough tracks where wheels would bog down. A train of dozens of animals, each loaded with panniers of textiles, ingots or grain, moves at a walking pace, perhaps 20 to 30 kilometers a day, stopping at wells, caravanserais and friendly towns. Handlers must manage feed and water, negotiate passage with local authorities, and keep careful inventories. Lose a single sealed bale, and you could be liable for a serious loss. On water, ships ply the rivers and the Gulf. Upstream, boats are hauled against the current by teams on towpaths, or moved with poles. Downstream, they ride the flow. Some craft are simple reed boats coated with bitumen. Others are wooden hulls, stitched or pegged together, carrying jars of oil and wine, bundles of wool, baskets of grain. Sea voyagers hug the coast, keeping land in sight as much as possible. Captains time departures to seasonal winds. Storms are feared, but so are reefs and unfamiliar harbours where a foreign crew might be vulnerable. In all of this, trade is not just about things. It is about ideas and habits. Styles travel. A particular way of carving cylinder seals appears first in one region, then shows up far away, adapted but recognizable. Pottery shapes spread. Jewelry fashions, spiral earrings, certain kinds of inlay migrate with the people who wear and sell them. Technologies travel. Metallurgical techniques, like how to alloy copper with tin for stronger bronze, move along with the metals themselves. So do ways of making cloth, brewing beer and baking bread. Even administrative tricks, how to keep accounts, how to seal containers to prevent tampering, spread with scribes and merchants. Diplomatic norms travel too. Kings in different lands begin to address one another as brother, send gifts of comparable prestige, and expect that messengers will be treated with respect. Letters from this broader Bronze Age world, preserved in palace archives, sound at times like carefully coded negotiations over status. How many fine garments should accompany a princess? What kind of horses count as an acceptable present? Whether a shipment of copper is pure enough? Behind the formal language lie shared assumptions about honour, reciprocity, and face-saving that make long-distance relations smoother. For Mesopotamian states, this trade is both a blessing and a vulnerability. On the one hand, it stabilizes. A city that depends on imported copper and timber has a strong reason to keep distant routes open, to avoid needless wars with the powers that control mountain passes and ports. Merchants who profit from steady exchange become a constituency in favour of order. Rulers who can guarantee safe passage and honest weights gain a reputation that draws commerce, and with it, revenue to their own gates. On the other hand, dependence means exposure. If a key source of tin is cut off by conflict or collapse, bronze production suffers. If pirates dominate a stretch of coast, or if a drought makes caravan routes impassable, cities downriver feel the shock in higher prices, shortages, and frustrated investors. Letters from kings complain about bad years when merchants cannot move and treasuries run thin. Sometimes the very wealth that trade brings invites conquest. A city that prospers by sitting on a choke point, a key ford, a narrow pass, a harbour, may find ambitious neighbours eager to seize that advantage. Fortresses along caravan routes, garrisons at river crossings, and war fleets near ports speak to a constant tension. Trade needs peace, but trade also funds war. Yet across centuries of shifting borders the web holds. Ships still leave Dilmun with cargoes of copper and wool. Donkeys still plod out of Ashur toward the Anatolian plateau. Scribes still weigh out silver and record debts, confident that a partner 1,000 kilometers away will understand the same symbols. Through this web, Mesopotamia is no longer just a river valley that learned to remember. It is part of a larger Bronze Age conversation, a conversation carried on in goods and gifts, in styles and scripts, in bargains struck around hearths from Anatolia to the Gulf. Out of that conversation, new powers begin to rise. Far to the north, in a small city on the Tigris, A line of kings and merchants is learning how to turn control of trade routes into something harder and sharper. Empire. Ashur begins small, not as the head of a conquering empire, but as one walled city perched on a bluff above the Tigris, watching caravans come and go. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, when Hammurabi is writing his laws far to the south, Ashur is something else entirely, a city that thinks of itself first as a community of merchants and as a community under a god. Even the name blurs the line. Ashur is the city. Ashur is also the chief god. In early texts, the city assembly and the god Assur can almost overlap. Kings call themselves not emperors but governors or stewards of Ashur, as if they are officials serving a divine owner. The ideology is simple and powerful. The city, its trade, its people are the property of the god. Rulers are caretakers. This matters because it gives Assyria a certain hardness. To disobey the king is not just to defy a man, it is to violate the will of Ashur. To refuse tribute is to steal from the god's estate. When Assyria later builds an empire, this old idea that there is a single divine landlord and everyone else are tenants will sit quietly underneath the proclamations of conquest. For now, though, Ashur is a city of ledgers and pack animals. Assyrian families run those trading colonies in Anatolia. They build up experience in moving large quantities of goods over long distances, negotiating with foreign rulers, solving logistics problems like feed, fodder, storage and security. When later Assyrian kings move armies instead of caravans, they will draw on this legacy. The skills are surprisingly transferable. Over the centuries, political winds shift. The great powers of the early 2nd millennium, the old kingdoms of Babylon, Mari, and others, rise and fall. Ashur weathers them. Sometimes it is under the shadow of a stronger neighbour. Sometimes it enjoys brief independence. Slowly, another identity layers itself on top of the merchant city, that of a kingdom with its own military teeth. By the early 1st millennium BCE, those teeth are bared. Assyria has turned itself into one of the most formidable war machines the ancient world ever saw. This did not happen overnight. It is the result of steady evolution in how war is organized. Assyrian kings invest heavily in a standing, trained corps of soldiers. Earlier city-states often relied on levies, farmers called up when needed, armed with what they could provide. Assyria keeps a permanent fighting force, drilled, equipped, and led by professional officers. Around this nucleus, they still summon provincial levies, but the balance has changed. War is no longer a temporary effort, it is a regular activity of the state. They innovate in weapons and tactics. Bronze gives way to iron. Assyrian smiths learned to make iron weapons in large numbers, spearheads, swords, arrowheads. The quality is not magically superior at first, but the supply can be more reliable and eventually cheaper. That lets them arm more men. They become masters of the bow, the spear, and something more frightening to their enemies, organized siegecraft. Earlier kings could threaten a city, blockade it, maybe try to storm a gate. Assyria turned sieges into a systematic art. Royal inscriptions and carved reliefs show battering rams with protected roofs, ladders, sappers digging under walls. They build siege ramps of earth and stone. They coordinate infantry, archers, and engineers. A city that resists is not just inconvenienced, it is methodically taken apart. Behind this battlefield capability lies an invisible backbone, logistics, moving tens of thousands of troops, with their animals, equipment, and provisions. Hundreds of kilometers from home is no small feat. Assyria uses its old merchant instincts on a larger scale. Campaign timing follows the agricultural calendar, so that troops can live off collected supplies without starving the farmers who must plant and harvest. Depots are established in conquered territories, stocked ahead of time. Roads are improved and marked. Messages move fast. Assyria builds a royal road system, with relay points where fresh horses and riders can pick up dispatches. A decision made in the capital can reach a distant general in days instead of weeks. This is administration in the service of war, and war in the service of administration. Conquest brings territory. Territory brings a new challenge: how to rule people who are not Assyrian. Assyria develops a provincial system. Conquered lands are turned into provinces, each governed by an Assyrian official, often called a governor responsible directly to the king. These governors collect tribute, administer justice in the king's name, and keep an eye on local elites. Strategic cities get Assyrian garrisons. Local rulers may be left in place as vassals if they are obedient, but they are not independent. They are monitored. Tribute is carefully calibrated. Some of it is regular and predictable, fixed amounts of grain, cattle, metals, timber. Some is symbolic, rare animals, luxury goods, hostages from royal families. Tribute is both revenue and ritual. It reenacts year after year the subordination of one king to another. When tribute fails, the response can be brutal. Assyria becomes notorious for one particular tool of control: mass deportations. When a city or region rebels, Assyrian armies may defeat it and then remove a significant portion of its population, resettling them elsewhere within the empire. People from the mountains find themselves on the plains. Inhabitants of a western city end up near the eastern frontier. Skilled workers are taken to the capital to build palaces and temples. Farmers fill empty fields far from home. To us, this sounds like a pure instrument of terror. And there is terror in it. Families are separated. Identities are shattered. But from the Assyrian perspective, there is also cold strategy. By breaking up compact, rebellious communities, they hope to reduce organized resistance. By mixing populations, they spread languages, crafts, and agricultural techniques. By moving specialists, they concentrate talent where the king wants it. Some deported communities, in later generations, seem to take root in their new homes, becoming integrated into the imperial fabric. This dual nature, harsh and integrative at once, runs through many aspects of the Assyrian system. We know much of this from the kings themselves. Assyrian royal inscriptions survive in great numbers, on stone slabs, on clay prisms, on palace walls. They are not quiet. Kings proclaim their victories in formulaic but vivid language. They boast of cities taken, enemies slain, rebels punished. They describe flaying leaders, piling up heads, driving captives in chains. They list tribute in loving detail: gold, silver, exotic animals, fragrant woods. These texts are not neutral reports. They are propaganda. Their purpose is to glorify the king, terrify enemies, and reassure Assur that his representative is doing his job. Defeats are ignored. Setbacks vanish. Campaigns become unbroken chains of success. Modern historians read them with caution. They compare the royal claims with archaeological layers in cities, with records from neighbouring states, with letters found in palace archives where officials write less theatrically. Some campaigns turn out to be more limited than advertised. Some rebellions, quietly mentioned in passing, may have been serious crises. The exaggeration itself is informative. It tells us what Assyrian kings wanted others to believe: that they were unstoppable, that resistance was futile, that Ashur's anger followed anyone who defied his empire. This message is carved not just in words, but in stone and brick. As Assyria grows, its rulers build monumental capitals that are almost like three-dimensional propaganda. Ashur, the old cult centre, remains sacred. But kings begin to found or expand new royal cities: Kalhu, often called Nimrud, Dur-Sharrukin, Nineveh. Each in its turn becomes the stage on which the empire presents itself. Palaces stretch across terraces, their walls lined with carved reliefs. In these panels, The king appears larger than everyone around him, towering above courtiers and captives. Scenes repeat the same themes. The king hunts lions, the king leads armies, the king receives tribute. Behind him march rows of soldiers in disciplined lines, chariots rolling, siege engines advancing. Trees, rivers, mountains, and enemy cities become mere backdrops to his presence. The art is detailed. You can see the patterning of garments, the harnesses of horses, the feathers on arrows. You can also see the deliberate contrast between order and chaos. Within Assyria, everything is organized, patterned, under control. Outside, enemies are shown in confusion and defeat. Architecture reinforces the message. Gates are flanked by colossal guardian figures, human-headed winged bulls and lions, watching silently. Courtyards open in sequence, guiding visitors deeper toward the throne room. The scale of everything, walls, doorways, columns, is meant to make human beings feel small in the presence of royal power. Yet even here, alongside displays of domination, there are hints of something more complex. Inscriptions describe gardens planted with trees brought from all over the empire, cedars from the west, fruit trees from far-off lands, exotic plants gathered as living trophies. Water channels mimic rivers. These gardens are not only symbols of control over nature, they are also spaces of pleasure and beauty, places where foreign and local species grow together. In the empire as a whole, a similar mixture appears. Assyria rules by fear, but not by fear alone. To keep such a vast territory functioning, they need roads maintained, fields sown, markets active. They rely on local elites to administer justice, collect taxes and maintain order. In some places, temples continue to operate under their old priesthoods, now offering prayers for the Assyrian king. In others, local gods are equated with Ashur or with other Assyrian deities, folded into a broader pantheon. Languages mingle. Akkadian in its Assyrian form is the language of power, but Aramaic spreads as a convenient lingua franca across the Near East. Assyrian officials use both. Documents are written in either tongue, sometimes side by side. Merchants take advantage of this shared medium to trade across the empire more easily than before. Over time, people in many regions begin to adopt elements of Assyrian material culture. Certain pottery styles, weights and measures, administrative practices. Some serve in the Assyrian army, rising in rank. Some marry into Assyrian families. Children grow up with mixed identities. From one angle, the empire looks like a machine of conquest driven by fear. From another, it looks like a network of administration, roads and shared practices that allows goods, ideas, and people to move more freely than they could in a world of many small warring states. The truth lies in the uneasy balance. Assyria rises from city to empire by combining hard power with intricate governance, terror with routine paperwork, deportation with new forms of belonging. It forges, sometimes violently, a kind of unity across the lands between and beyond the two rivers. But in doing so, it also stretches itself. The very complexity that makes the empire effective makes it fragile. A system that depends on constant campaigning, heavy tribute, and the towering presence of the king can be shaken if those elements falter. Sooner or later they will, and when Assyria's roar finally fades, another old city downriver will find an opening to step forward once again, claiming the title that has echoed through Mesopotamian history for more than 1,000 years, King of Babylon, King of the 4 quarters of the world. When Assyria finally falls, it doesn't fall like a single wall kicked in by one angry neighbour. It crumples in stages under the weight of its own success. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria is enormous. Its kings rule from Egypt's border to the mountains of Iran, from the Gulf to Anatolia. Holding that territory requires constant motion, yearly campaigns, endless tribute, layers of officials and garrisons. As long as the king is strong and the armies keep winning, the machine runs. But nothing runs forever at full speed. Internal strains begin to show. Succession disputes unsettle the royal court. Provinces groan under heavy taxes and requisitions. The deportation system that once spread skills and loyalty now also spreads resentment. Assyrian sources, as usual, are not eager to admit weakness. They boast, as always, of victories. Yet letters and later accounts hint at fraying cohesion, at local governors acting more independently, at rival claimants to the throne. Outside the empire, old enemies watch and wait. In the south, Babylon has spent generations under Assyrian pressure. Its sacred status as the city of Marduk has protected it at times, but its kings have frequently been vassals, its politics manipulated. Revolts have been crushed, temples have suffered, yet the name King of Babylon still carries immense prestige. Whoever holds that title can claim a kind of moral leadership in Mesopotamia. To the east, in the Zagros foothills, the Medes grow stronger. They are a collection of highland polities, not a centralized state in the modern sense, but they share interests and enemies. They know that the Assyrians, for all their strength, are not immortal. At the end of the 620s and into the 610s BCE, these tensions converge. Civil war breaks out within Assyria after the death of a king. We do not have a complete, neutral narrative of what happens next. Later Babylonian chronicles give terse entries. Assyrian inscriptions grow thin. Archaeology shows destruction in some Assyrian cities around this time, layers of burning and collapse. Historians piece together a picture: internal conflict, rival claimants, and opportunistic uprisings in subject regions. In Babylon, a local leader named Nabopolassar emerges. He appears first in our sources as a rebel who manages to seize Babylon and proclaim himself king. His origins are debated. Some think he was a Chaldean from the tribal groups of southern Mesopotamia that had long troubled Assyrian rule. Others see him simply as a capable Babylonian general. Either way, he understands that Babylon alone cannot topple Assyria. So he makes a choice that would have seemed shocking a century earlier. He allies with the Medes. Together, Babylonian and Median forces campaign against Assyria's heartland. They besiege and take Assyrian cities one by one. In 612 BCE, they turn their attention to Nineveh, the great royal city on the Tigris. Later texts, especially from Babylon, will tell this as a story of divine justice, of Assyria finally punished for its arrogance. The archaeological record shows a fierce destruction, collapsed walls, thick ash, arrowheads in burned rooms. At some point, Nineveh falls. The last Assyrian rulers attempt to regroup farther west, but within a few years the empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries exists only as scattered remnants. Out of this wreckage, Nabopolassar's dynasty builds what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. For Babylonians, it is not neo-anything. It is Babylon again, Babylon restored. Nabopolassar spends much of his reign fighting, securing territory, and pushing Assyria's former western holdings into the Babylonian orbit. When he dies, around 605 BCE, his son takes the throne, Nebuchadnezzar II. This is the name that will echo longest. Nebuchadnezzar II is a successful general even before becoming king. As ruler, he inherits a large, somewhat loosely held empire: Syria, parts of Anatolia, the Levant, and the old Babylonian core in the south. He spends decades on campaign, especially in the west, where Egypt still tries to influence local kings. Some of his actions are remembered in later traditions: the capture of Jerusalem, the deportations of elites and craftsmen to Babylon, the reshaping of the politics of Judah. For the Babylonians themselves, these events are part of a larger pattern, asserting imperial authority, securing loyal vassals along the empire's western frontier. At home, Nebuchadnezzar turns Babylon into something close to a myth made brick. We have both texts that celebrate his building works and the foundations themselves excavated by archaeologists. City walls are rebuilt and massively expanded, with multiple circuits encircling Babylon. The famed impenetrable Wall of Babylon that later Greek authors describe likely exaggerates, but the archaeology confirms impressive fortifications broad enough in places for processions and possibly chariots. Temples are restored and enlarged. Foremost among them is the great temple of Marduk, Esagila, and the nearby ziggurat often associated with the later Tower of Babel story. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions list staggering quantities of baked brick, bitumen, cedar beams, gold plating. Not all of this can be checked line by line, but the surviving ruins show a dense, monumental temple district. The city's main ceremonial street, the processional way, is paved and lined with walls decorated in moulded glazed bricks in deep blues, golds and whites. Along this way stands the Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in a Berlin museum from thousands of original fragments. Rows of striding lions, bulls, and hybrid dragons in raised relief accompany the route. These are not dreams, we can see them. Count their bricks, read the cuneiform stamps naming Nebuchadnezzar. This urban splendour is not just about beauty, it is theology written in architecture. In Neo-Babylonian religion and politics, Marduk sits at the centre. Earlier, Mesopotamian pantheons were more balanced, with Enlil of Nippur or others holding high rank. By this late period, Babylonian theologians have elevated Marduk above almost all rivals. Hymns recount how he received the Tablet of Destinies and became chief of the gods. Legal documents are dated by formulas invoking his power. Every year, when possible, this cosmic order is renewed in the Akitu, the New Year festival. The details of the rituals come down to us in bits and pieces, clay tablets with liturgies, later commentaries, but the overall pattern is clear enough. In the spring, the statue of Marduk is brought in solemn procession from his temple to a special festival house outside the city. The king plays a carefully scripted role, appearing before the god, having his insignia briefly stripped, then restored. The message is simple and profound. The human king rules only by Marduk's favour. The empire's victories, the city's prosperity, all rest on the god's continued consent. When foreign kings are defeated, as in Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns, Babylonian texts sometimes describe this as Marduk asserting order over chaos, much like the older myth in which he defeats the primordial sea. Politics and myth blur, history is written as theology unfolding. In the background of this ritual and political life, something quietly remarkable is happening on the rooftops and in the temple courtyards. Babylonian scholars are watching the sky. For centuries, Mesopotamian priests had noted eclipses, peculiar stars, and ominous comets as signs from the gods, folded into omen collections. In the Neo-Babylonian period and shortly after, these observations become more systematic. Astronomers, often temple scholars, record planetary positions night after night. They create long lists of data: when Venus appears, when Jupiter pauses and reverses direction in the sky, how often certain eclipses occur. At first, this is still framed as divination. The movements of the heavens are messages. But careful attention to those messages produces something new: pattern recognition. Over time, Babylonian astronomers develop mathematical schemes to predict certain celestial events. They do not have our modern physics, but they have cycles, numbers, and a sense that the sky behaves in regular ways. Clay tablets from this tradition survive, filled with columns of numbers, schematic drawings and notes. Later Greek science will borrow heavily from this accumulated knowledge. In a quiet, methodical way, Babylon's night watch becomes one of the city's most enduring legacies. For all its splendour, the Neo-Babylonian Empire is not invulnerable. Its strength is concentrated in a few core cities, its kings heavily tied to the person of Marduk and the rituals of Babylon. governing a mosaic of Western territories, Phoenician ports, Aramaean tribes, small Levantine kingdoms, requires constant attention. Internal politics remain complex, with powerful priestly families, learned scribes and court factions. After Nebuchadnezzar II, a rapid succession of short-reigning kings hints at instability. Some are removed in palace intrigues, others leave few traces beyond their names. One ruler, Nabonidus, breaks with certain expectations by favouring the moon god Sin and spending long stretches away from Babylon in an oasis city in the west. Later Babylonian priests, who see this as neglect of Marduk, portray him unfavourably. It is hard to know exactly how his contemporaries felt, but the tension between royal choices and temple traditions is evident. Beyond the empire's borders, a new power is taking shape on the Iranian plateau. Persian clans, once vassals of the Medes, are consolidating under a ruler named Cyrus. They inherit some of the same highland energies that once helped topple Assyria, but they add something else, an ability to integrate different groups under a relatively flexible model of kingship. By the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus is moving westward, defeating the Medes, then the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. His advance brings him closer and closer to Babylon's frontier. Some Babylonian elites may see him as a distant factor, others perhaps already calculate what his rise might mean. The empire of Nebuchadnezzar still glitters. Its temples are active, its walls stand tall, its scholars track the planets. The New Year festival still proclaims Marduk's supremacy and the king's chosen status. Yet, beneath the surface, the old pattern of Mesopotamian history is repeating. An empire stretched wide, a court wrestling with succession and religious expectations, provincial elites weighing their loyalties. And beyond the horizon, in the mountains and plains to the east, another kingdom quietly preparing to cross the rivers, to inherit roads, cities and traditions it did not build, but would soon claim as its own. When Cyrus finally comes, he does not arrive as a destroyer in the old Assyrian style. He comes as a solution to someone else's problem. In 539 BCE, the armies of the Persian king Cyrus II moved toward Babylon. The exact sequence of battles and negotiations is still debated. Later Greek authors give colourful stories. Babylonian chronicles are brief and dry. We know there was a clash near the city of Opis on the Tigris, and that the Persians won. We know some Babylonian forces, or at least parts of the elite, chose not to resist to the last brick. When Cyrus enters Babylon, the city does not go up in flames. Its walls are not smashed. Its great temples are not razed. Instead, a new king simply begins dating documents in his own name. Cyrus presents himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the chosen restorer of order. On the famous clay cylinder that bears his inscription, written in Babylonian cuneiform, in the local tradition, he claims that the god Marduk was angry at Nabonidus for neglecting proper worship, and that Marduk searched the lands for a righteous prince. Cyrus, of course, is that prince. The message is clear. Nothing fundamental has changed except the man on the throne. For the people who live in Babylon and the cities of southern Mesopotamia, that is exactly how it feels. The temples are still there. The ziggurats still tower over the flat river plain. Priests still tend to the cult statues each morning, bathing them, dressing them, offering food and incense. Scribes still sit with reed styluses and clay tablets, drafting contracts, recording loans, noting birth and death dates, marking the phases of the moon. Under the Achaemenid Persians, Mesopotamia becomes a province in a much larger empire, a satrapy among many. Yet daily life in Uruk or Nippur or Babylon continues inside frameworks that are centuries, even millennia old. Cyrus and his successors understand something that earlier conquerors sometimes ignored. Stability comes from continuity. So Persian kings support local temples across the empire, not only in Mesopotamia but in Anatolia, Syria and beyond. They present themselves as legitimate heirs of local traditions. They sponsor repairs to shrines, restore statues that had been taken as war booty, confirm privileges for priestly families. The empire becomes a patchwork of sacred centres, each speaking to its own gods, all acknowledging the King of Kings at the top. Administration, too, keeps one foot in the old world. Cuneiform does not vanish with a single conquest. For generations after Cyrus, scribes in southern Mesopotamia continue to write in Akkadian and Sumerian on clay tablets. They still copy ancient hymns and legal formulas. They still train apprentices with textbook exercises that go back to the old Babylonian period. At the same time, a quieter shift is underway. Across the broader Near East, another language has become the everyday tongue of merchants, soldiers and diplomats, Aramaic. Aramaic uses a very different writing system, an alphabet written with ink on parchment or papyrus, or carved into stone. It is quicker to learn than cuneiform, more portable than clay tablets, and it spreads easily along the road network the Persians maintain. Under the Achaemenids, Aramaic becomes the empire's main administrative language. Royal decrees might still appear in multiple scripts and tongues on stone monuments, but the letters sent between satraps, the lists of taxes and supplies, the correspondence of middle-ranking officials are often written in Aramaic. On the ground, this means that a Babylonian scribe who wants to advance in Persian administration now needs two worlds in his head, the old wedge-shaped signs and the new alphabetic script. For a while, they coexist. We find clay tablets with brief Aramaic notes inked on their edges. We find officials with both Babylonian and Persian names. We see contracts that follow Mesopotamian legal formulas, almost word for word, but are dated by the regnal years of Persian kings. Then, slowly, the balance tips. Clay is heavy, parchment rots. Over the centuries, documents written in Aramaic on perishable materials disappear into the soil and air. Cuneiform, because it is baked earth, lingers in the archaeological record, even as its use declines in everyday life. This creates a strange effect for modern eyes. From the surviving tablets, it looks as if Babylonian culture continues almost unchanged for a long time, then suddenly drops away. But part of that sudden end is an illusion created by preservation. The conversations, arguments and negotiations happening in Aramaic are mostly gone. The voices of farmers, minor officials and traders who wrote on leather or papyrus are faint, if not entirely silent. And yet, before the script finally fades, Mesopotamia has already given a great deal to the world beyond its rivers. It has given writing itself, at least in one of its earliest, most influential forms. The idea that sounds or words can be fixed in lasting signs, that the flow of speech can be turned into marks and stored, is first fully realized here. Cuneiform begins as accounting, grows into literature, law, science, and prayer. Even when other scripts replace it, the basic insight remains. Knowledge can be externalized, preserved, and transmitted far beyond the memory of any one person. It has given traditions of law and kingship. Long before Cyrus, Sargon, Hammurabi, and countless lesser rulers issued collections of rules and judgments. These are not laws in the modern sense, but they establish principles, standardized penalties, protections for property, expectations about contracts, and family obligations. Later cultures, from the Hittites and Israelites to Greek and Roman thinkers, operate in a world already shaped by these ideas of ordered, written justice and kingly responsibility. It has given models of the city. The Mesopotamian city is not just a cluster of houses. It is a planned space with walls, gates, temple quarters, markets and administrative buildings. It is a place where surplus is stored, redistributed, taxed, where specialized crafts cluster, where written records are kept. This template spreads outward. When later cities rise from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, they inherit, directly or indirectly, parts of this Mesopotamian urban logic, and it has given ways of measuring the invisible. Mesopotamian astronomers and mathematicians leave us sexagesimal, base 60 mathematics, still echoing in our 60 minutes to the hour and 360 degrees to the circle. They chart celestial cycles, experiment with calendars, and refine methods for dividing time and space. Later Greek, Indian, and Islamic sciences do not simply copy their work, but they build atop foundations first laid in temple courtyards along the Euphrates. For all this, our picture of Mesopotamia's last centuries under Persian, then Hellenistic, then Parthian and Roman influence is fragmentary. Clay tablets thin out. Many cities remain unexcavated or lie beneath modern construction and high groundwater. Entire archives may still sleep under fields and streets. Texts that once existed in thousands of copies, epics, rituals, astronomical records unknown today from a handful of damaged fragments. Scholars disagree on key questions. How far did Mesopotamian ideas travel, and by what routes? To what extent did Persian administrators adapt local legal norms rather than impose their own? How late did cuneiform survive in learned circles? Each new find a sealed jar of tablets, a broken inscription reused in a later wall can shift debates, reopen old arguments, close others. In a way, this uncertainty fits the subject. Mesopotamia is a civilization that loved records, but whose record is incomplete. It invented ways to remember, yet much of what it knew has been forgotten, its tablets dissolved, its papyri dust, and still something endures. When we divide the day into hours, when we picture history as a series of empires rising and falling, when we imagine a walled city with a sacred centre and a royal palace, we are, often without knowing it, dreaming in shapes first traced in the mud between the Tigris and Euphrates. Stories of floods and towers, gardens and exiles, wise kings and arrogant ones, these too carry faint reflections of older tales told in Sumerian and Akkadian, copied by generations of scribes who never knew their work would echo beyond their own world. Under the Persians, Mesopotamia becomes one province among many. But in the long view, the land between two rivers remains something more than a satrapy on a royal list. It is a memory machine humanity built for itself, an early attempt to fix time, space, law, and story in lasting forms. Most of its buildings have crumbled, most of its names are lost. Yet when we look up at the night sky and think in numbers, when we walk through modern cities planned in grids and quarters, when we open a book to read about a past older than our own, we are still moving through the long shadow of that ancient experiment. The rivers have shifted their courses, the empires have changed their names, but Mesopotamia is still there, quiet beneath the dust, woven into the ways we count, rule, build, and remember. Somewhere, right now, those rivers are still flowing. The Tigris and Euphrates run past the ruins of cities that once held tens of thousands of people, past tells that look like ordinary hills until a shovel or a bulldozer cuts into them and releases clay tablets that have not seen daylight in 4,000 years. We have followed that arc tonight, from the first hesitant villages on the wet edges of fields, to canals and temple granaries, to city walls and ziggurats, to kings who dreamed of ruling from the upper sea to the lower sea, and finally to empires so large that Mesopotamia became only one region among many. The details blur together, names multiply and fade. Sumer, Akkad, Ur, Ezin, Larsa, Babylon, Ashur, Nineveh, again and again. Fields are measured, taxed, left follow, planted once more. Armies march down the same dusty roads under different banners. Scribes copy older texts and then themselves become part of the past someone else will try to reconstruct. What remains is the pattern. A river valley that learned to remember, then learned to write, then learned to build worlds on top of words. generation after generation trying to make order from flood and drought, from surplus and shortage, from fear of the gods and fear of one another. If you let your mind drift, you can almost hear them. A farmer in a reed hut, listening for the sound of water in the irrigation channel, knowing that somewhere upstream someone else's decision will shape his harvest. A young apprentice in a tablet-filled room, scratching wedge marks over and over until his hand cramps, copying a law code or an old hymn in a script that already belongs to centuries before him. A priest standing at the top of a ramped tower, looking out over a flat plain dotted with fields and villages, and smoke from hearth fires, reading omens in the stars and in the liver of a sacrificed sheep, trying to map the will of unseen powers onto the fragile plans of a king. All of them lived in worlds that felt solid and permanent. All of them were wrong. The canals silted up, the languages shifted and then vanished. The baked bricks were carried away for new buildings. Even the gods changed names and faces, merged or disappeared. But not everything was lost. Some ideas slipped quietly out of Mesopotamia and kept walking. Ways of counting, of dividing time, of organizing cities, of thinking about written law and royal duty. We still inhabit those ideas, or versions of them, long after the original walls that framed them collapsed. There is something calming in that. Civilizations rise, exhaust themselves, and fall. Their writing systems go silent. Their monuments turn into quarries. Yet traces persist in habits so ordinary we no longer notice their age. You, lying wherever you are right now, are part of that chain, using a device filled with symbols to listen to a story about a place where the very notion of recorded story first took shape. Most of the people who lived along those rivers never imagined you. They did not know about continents they would never see, or about a planet mapped from space, or about someone far in the future listening to tales of their kings as they tried to drift to sleep. Still, a few of their impulses would be familiar. The wish to remember, the fear of forgetting, the urge to talk to those who are not in the room with you. Those threads run straight from their clay tablets to your screen. If your eyes are heavy now, you can let the last details of dynasties and dates slip away. Just hold on to the image of a wide river plain under a deep sky, of lights blinking out one by one in houses along a canal, of the slow turning of the stars overhead. Before you drift off, one small thing. If you found this journey through ancient Mesopotamia soothing or interesting, it helps a lot if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you can find your way back to more stories like this. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. A city by the sea at 11 p.m, a quiet village at dawn, a crowded apartment at 2 in the morning. Write it below if you feel like sharing. In its own way, that list of places and times will be a tiny modern tablet, a record of the scattered audience gathered around this old story. For now, though, you don't need to remember Sargon's conquests or Hammurabi's clauses, or the exact length of a Babylonian cubit. You can let the land between two rivers fade into darkness, its ruins resting under layers of silt and sleep, its ideas still moving quietly through your world. The floods have come and gone. The empires have risen and fallen. It's enough to know that someone long ago lit the first lamps along those banks, looked up at the same moon, and began to write. Good night from Mesopotamia. Good night from the land between two rivers.